So we're on day 5 of our course, and the primary topic for today is going to be two-dimensional shapes, and then moving into three-dimensional shapes tomorrow. So we're going to be making a segue here from working with the compass to working with making three-dimensional forms. So one aspect of this is that if we take a look at the way that we've structured the course so far, we started out on the opening weekend looking at different aspects, different fields within sacred geometry. Because today, sacred geometry is a bit of a buzzword. And if you read a specific book that talks about sacred geometry, or you go to a particular course that talks about sacred geometry, it might actually be dealing with any of these different fields that we talked about on the weekend. So it could be talking about health and healing. You could be doing a healing course, and they talk about sacred geometry of the human body or of the fields of energy you're working with. Or it could be a course where it's sacred geometry, but what you do the entire time is work with the compass and the ruler, the masters of the compass type of tradition. Or it might be a course in spiritual meditation where they talk about sacred geometry, dealing with higher worlds and patterns of initiation. So we wanted to have that opening weekend to give us a context of the overview of these different pieces that people work with sacred geometry within today. So you get a sense of how these pieces fit together into a larger whole. And so what we're doing now on these 5 days is we're going through specific key patterns in sacred geometry, the ones that are really universal and found in every spiritual tradition, that are foundations for the patterns of life and creation throughout every scale of nature. And we've also put the course together in such a way that there's a combination of my giving the lectures and the slides to give you a context and an overview of the material, then working with Jane to do the actual compass work and the three-dimensional constructions, and working with Elizabeth to do the work with actually moving the patterns with our physical and energetic bodies. So let me say a little bit more about this context and the way these things fit together. One of the very important ideas that we've touched on just briefly so far is the way that the human energy body is constructed in a particular way. And one thing that we described at one point was the harmonic coding of 3 related to the human astral body, which we mentioned is the reason why if you work with Sufis, they'll teach you a system in which you use the head, the heart, and your hands. If you work with a Buddhist, it'll be thought, speech, and action. If you work with a Rosicrucian, it might be thinking, feeling, and willing. Many different variations of this. If you do work in Chinese Qigong, they will talk about the upper, middle, and lower Dantian centers in the body. These being 3 primary anchor centers in the human energy body that our consciousness is rooted in. And the interaction of these 3 centers are absolutely vital for the functioning of human consciousness and connection to our energy centers. So one of the important aspects of the work that we've been doing is that depending on the center that you are working from, there are different states of consciousness involved, and there's different types of activity that these centers are specialized for a particular function. So what I mean by that is that if you do 0-point centering into the center of the head center, you'll have a different experience of the energy quality than if you do it at the heart or at the hara, the center in the belly, for instance. This also means that this requires a shift of consciousness to go from one type of learning to another type of learning. And in our particular culture today, what we tend to esteem in our culture is the intellect. And so often we can be forced into a mode in which we develop the intellect to a fairly high state, but other aspects of our learning modalities don't develop as far. And I'll return to that in just a moment. There's also the aspect of this, of what's sometimes referred to as the primary learning modalities of people, in which you have the visual, the auditory, and the kinesthetic. So some people primarily get information from what they see, others from what they hear, and others from what they feel. And so we've tried to put together the course in such a way that there's both visual, auditory, and kinesthetic aspects, so that you're actually making the movements with the kinesthetic, which is the part that tends to get left out, in addition to the visual and the auditory. There's an interesting initiation saying that comes from the Rosicrucian tradition, which I've always really liked, which is an expression of the way that as we develop spiritually, we go through stages of actually uniting with higher spiritual realities and beings. And that particular saying is that in the beginning, we see the beloved from afar. And then at the next stage, we hear the voice of the beloved call to us. And then at the next stage, we embrace and become one with the beloved. And these particular stages of seeing and hearing and then union are a very important concept for us related to these modalities of the visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. This is also related to 3 stages of initiation that in Rosicrucianism is called imagination, inspiration, and intuition. And the basic concept behind this is that we can develop a type of spiritual perception that is based on visual images. And that's what the Rosicrucians call imagination. That's where you are literally seeing spiritual images in the head center. And it's a visual representation of non-physical realities. At the next stage, you can develop a capacity of inspiration, which is hearing the harmony of the spheres. And at this point, realities are revealing themselves through the tones that they emit. And this can be either the harmony of the spheres in general, or every spiritual being has a particular type of tone. This is also related to the way that people's voices have different tones to them. Since I am primarily auditory, I don't pick up a lot of information about people from what they look like. And so half the time you'll notice that when I'm speaking, I'm not looking at you. I'm primarily auditory. And so I can read a person's energy through their voice. The voice is a track, and I know different aspects of their personality, etc., from the voice tonality. And again, it might be different for another person. Then the final stage is intuition. And intuition is a direct knowing through a kind of internal union with the essence of the vibration of the person or thing that one is working with. And so again, in this Rosicrucian saying of seeing the beloved from afar, hearing the voice of the beloved call to one, and then embracing and becoming one with the beloved, is related to these 3 stages of spiritual development. They don't always have to go in that particular sequence, but there are 3 different types of spiritual perception. And you will find people, if you talk with different psychics, some psychics know through these different faculties, some primarily see things, some know through more of this tonality aspect, and some know by having it mirrored in their body. Like some medical intuitives will actually see the pattern with a person, others will know it because they mirror it in their own body and they feel it in themselves. So understanding these different aspects of ourselves, let me tie that into something else here, which is that when we are learning something that is more on the intellectual head level, which is primarily what I'm doing when I'm doing the slides with you, and I'm giving you the dialogue that goes along with the information with the slides. That requires you to be in a particular state of conscious awareness to absorb it. That's more toward the intellectual and the head side. The opposite pole to that is the state of consciousness that we need to be in to experience things kinesthetically and to experience it in the body, and for instance through movement. And so there has to be a shift of awareness from level to level. And so this means that, for instance, there is a complementary but polar opposite aspect between that intellectual focus, between what I'm presenting and what you're experiencing in the eurythmy class with Elizabeth, in which there's a matter of having to switch to another state of consciousness where one is fully aware at the kinesthetic feeling level and to unite with that. Because, for instance, if one tries to do some type of internal energy practice, whether it's Qigong or whether it's eurythmy, anything that has to do with internal energy movement, and you try to do it from the intellectual center, it will have almost no effect, and it really will make no sense whatsoever, because it's not based so much on getting the concept, it's based on getting the experience. And so that capacity to shift from the reflective consciousness of the mental to the directly participatory consciousness of the movement is something that's very important to work on as a direct shift. And sometimes, again, for people in our culture, that can be a hard shift to make. So that in the way that we've put this together, with my presenting things with the context and the intellectual information, that then goes to the level of your beginning to work with the pattern directly with Jane and actually drawing out the pattern and soon constructing the pattern in 3 dimensions. And then to the next stage, working with Elizabeth to directly work on getting the energy pattern in your own energy body and experiencing it directly. So that, for instance, when we did the work where I said a little bit about projective geometry and it forms the outline and gives you the energy matrix for everything from the Hebrew letters on the outside of the sphere of creation in the Hebrew Kabbalah to the work in projective geometry, in which you see the form of the leaf or the stone being formed by the peripheral forces raying to the center. And then you worked with Jane and you did this particular practice with the straight lines all coming in and creating the circular form. And then working with Elizabeth, where she says we need to unite in moving with the line of light. If we're just thinking intellectually about a line of light, then all we're doing is just moving the physical body a little bit, and it's not very interesting. If, on the other hand, we're actually shift into kinesthetic awareness and become aware of an actual line of light that we're uniting the energy body with, then that becomes a much more fascinating experience. It becomes similar to the experience that a surfer has when a surfer is in the sweet spot of the wave and they shoot the curl. When you become aware that these matrices of energy that we have described intellectually are something that are empirically present, and that we can actually become aware of these energies, unite with them, move with them energetically, and apply them directly. So for instance, when we talked about the masters of the net and these matrices of energy that make up our world, at first it might be a concept, but then we might learn something like the matrix of energy that makes up the human energy body. For instance, the 12 primary energy meridians that run through the body that are taught in Chinese medicine. Then we might get to the point where we do some type of work with a discipline like Jinsen Jitsu, Ki-Iki Jitsu, energy psychology, and you find that by tapping particular centers, you get a particular energetic effect. And you get to the place of realizing that these matrices are not something symbolic, they're not something philosophical, they actually exist in the energy body. And so you realize that I can now learn the overall matrix of all these points. Because to be honest, in many fields like energy psychology today, they tend to teach you something fairly instrumental, like have this particular type of affirmation, tap these points, and you'll clear your issue. But they don't always tell you that this is a point on a particular energy meridian, and that all these different points on the different meridians have specific functions. And that meridian connects to this next meridian, and the one after it. And here's the crossover point at this particular energy point, and the way the whole matrix works. Once we know the entire matrix, we can begin to learn all the different functions and apply them directly. So what starts out as an intellectual idea that often gets reduced to something symbolic and philosophical, far too often in our culture, of this idea of these matrices of energy, we then find are empirically true, and we can unite with them and use them for all types of powerful purposes. So that, again, when we move to the stage of doing the movement in the eurythmy, we have to actually shift our awareness to actually unite with the movement itself. If we're doing the E-A-O pattern, for example, and the only thing in our awareness is just the basic movement of the body like this, there's not a whole lot to it. But if you become aware that there is a literal line of light through the center that you can align with, the experience of that line of light and the ability to become aware of it on a semi-permanent basis as a balancing activity, and then feeling the difference with the light that moves you forward and that moves you backward, becomes something that's much more visceral. And this is related to what we've described before in developing the body of light. Working at a purely intellectual level, I don't want to dismiss, because that's primarily the thing that I'm offering, but at the same time, it's only one part of an overall pattern. There's a reason why we have the head, the heart, and the hara as separate functions in the body. Why don't we just have one thing that does everything? Because the separate functions are needed. They each do something particular that we have to develop. Every center has got to be developed in and of itself. A person without a head is going to have trouble living in the world. But if you don't have a heart, then what's the purpose of being here anyway? And if you don't have an active will center, then your enjoyment of life is going to be severely curtailed. So every one of these centers has a particular activity to it. And so the head center allows us to understand this overall context where things fit together and have a freedom of choice. And the heart center unites us in our soul life to actually experience at a feeling level the significance of spirit in the world. And then the will center allows us to directly participate at a kinesthetic feeling level with all of the energies in creation. And so all these things are necessary, and we have to bear in mind that we have to actually shift consciousness from level to level and develop both the capacity to shift at will and the capacity to start alchemically merging these centers together so they all work together in tandem. Let me just say a side note here related to processes of meditation, for example. Many schools of meditation will teach particular types of meditation that go to one polarity or the other and teach only one of two polarities. Those two polarities are active meditation or receptive meditation. It's not that one is good and one is bad, or one is important and one is not important. They're both absolutely vital. So that schools of receptive meditation, for example, Vipassana or Zen meditation, they focus on this aspect of clearing the chatter from the monkey mind and having a direct view of reality and really getting the mind clear to perceive what's really in front of us. Also, these schools talk about the other school, the active school, where you're generating things with the mind, and they say, well, you can never really tell if what you're perceiving is true or not because you're projecting so much stuff. We, on the other hand, are clearing the mind out, and we have a direct perception, and we're no longer generating these things to create that fog. On the other side, you have the schools of active meditation, which are things like creative visualization. And the creative visualization actually creates energies and functions, activities, through the mind itself. It can be anything from a creative visualization that will take you through a guided visualization where you relax through going through particular stages. You're walking in a calm forest and you come to a waterfall, etc., etc. To types of visualization where you're actually creating energetic forms and applying them for healing. And that school says, well, the passive school isn't really doing anything, they're just sitting there, but we're actually doing something, we're helping people, we're creating something. But the two things have to be balanced together, and they're both right. So that the receptive school is developing the capacity to actually perceive spiritual reality and things around us as they actually are, without constantly projecting stuff outward. Whereas the active school is developing the capacity to use the mind as a creative function and to create things through it. And these two things have to be balanced. But they are two different activities. This is something we talked about for those of you that took the biogeometry training. Because in the biogeometry training, one of the things that we emphasized was that when you're learning the type of vibrational dowsing that the Egyptians do, you're not asking a mental question, please show me something. You're not asking any mental question. You're not even really in the mental function. All you're doing is using pure awareness to use whatever aspect of the vibrational energy tool that you're using is tuning into, either through a quality of angle or quality of length, to test for the absence or presence of a particular energetic quality. And we emphasized at that time that you can't really do this from the active mind, it's from the receptive mind. That you're simply aware with this, you're connected to it energetically, vibrationally, and you see if you pick up the energy or not. So that people that are heavily intellectual have a little bit of a break-in period to do that type of work, because it's hard for them to get to that empty, open stage to actually perceive what's actually there vibrationally. And so again, the same thing is true for what we're doing here when we shift from the intellectual focus to the kinesthetic focus of doing very subtle energy movement practices. And this can be true again with Qigong, Tai Chi, Eurythmy, all of these energetic practices, to be able to shift to the state of awareness where we directly experience it. But it's part of a unified system. For instance, in the Chinese system, they have a discussion of internal alchemy, where there's an alchemical mixture between the fully activated centers of the head, the heart, and the lower will center. And that alchemical mixture is very important. It develops the fully active body of light. So for all the different things that we're exploring here, and in the way that we're exploring it as a trinity with myself, Jane, and Elizabeth, then we're getting the overall context, we're beginning to work with creating the form, and then we are, in a sense, becoming the energetic form and opening up the blockages in our body to be able to move with the energy pattern itself. And what we find is that even though we might be highly developed in a particular area, I might be able to talk a good game and know a lot of intellectual stuff, but look at me move, and you'll see places where my movement is not smooth, where my movement is not clear. Or a person might be an excellent healer in a part of their vibrational body, but there's still places where things are not perfectly balanced or perfectly smooth, for example. So this becomes something not to pass judgment on me or pass judgment on anybody else. It's a matter of simply being able to move ourselves to the next stage of development by looking at different functions and activities and getting a sense of where can I still improve. And so a little side story here. When I lived in Okinawa for 3 years, when I was an instructor in the Marine Corps in the nuclear biological chemical field, one of the things that at this point in the early 80s was just coming out was the start of what later became the ninja craze. And it started before it became all of these really bad movies with ninjas jumping around and cutting flips and stuff. It started with an American named Stephen Hayes going to Japan and looking to see, are there any real ninjas still around? And what he found was a particular group that was a descendant of the original ninja clans that became stuff of legend from the Koga and Iga provinces of Japan. And he found a man named Masaaki Hatsumi, who was actually a bone doctor and had inherited many of these lineages of ninjutsu. And so it was Stephen Hayes meeting Masaaki Hatsumi that led to this original revitalization of interest in the West in ninjutsu, which quickly became this kind of ridiculous fad. But the essence of it was something very fascinating. And so a couple of things that they had as their original teachings I found very interesting. And so a couple of the teachings that came from Masaaki Hatsumi and these original ninja lineages is at one point they asked Masaaki Hatsumi, they said, what is the final secret of ninjutsu, this very secret art? And he says there is only one secret, and that is keep walking. That every obstacle in your life is an illusion, and if you keep walking, all obstacles will disappear. And I thought that was a beautiful observation, because we can often come up against obstacles and basically stop walking. But to get to our goal, all we got to do is keep walking, and we're going to get to where we want to go to. There's sometimes I think a misunderstanding in spiritual circles where sometimes when something's really meant to happen, things fall in place really easily, and we say, oh, well, it was meant to happen, it all just came together, that's great. And sometimes that happens. But some things that are very, very important to happen don't come together easily. You might have to work on it for years. That doesn't mean it wasn't meant to happen. It just means that you go through the school of hard knocks and you develop strengths and capacities you could never develop any other way until finally it will manifest. Now there's another aspect of this from the ninjutsu school as well, which is that they had a teaching that I thought was just beautiful. And that was that Masaaki Hatsumi talked about the man that he trained with, his grandmaster, who had passed down the lineage to him. And so Masaaki Hatsumi, as a young man, while he was training in the medical arts and in the martial arts, he really wanted to be the best martial artist in the world. So he asked his master one day, he says, you know, do you think I'm on the way to becoming a great martial artist? And his master stopped for a second and looked at him and said, you will never be a great martial artist. And that just crushed Hatsumi. But his master then looked at him and said, but you have the capacity to become a tetsujin. And at the time, that didn't mean much to Hatsumi, but he says that today that's the best compliment he could ever be paid, because the Japanese term tetsujin means a human being that has developed every facet of their potential, every facet of their personality, every facet of every part of their subtle bodies, every possibility within the human capacities to live in the world. And he said what a great compliment he was. He was directing my attention away from the ability to beat somebody up to actually developing myself as a human being for every possible facet. And that's a very important concept, which in these ninjutsu lineages led to another important idea, which is that we can very often in life, because of the way that we are conditioned through trauma and shock, through all of the experiences of life, we can cut out certain potentials for ourselves because we associate pain with those parts of life. I was a kid, I'm tall and I'm gangly, and I try to dance and everybody laughs at me, so I stopped trying to dance. I stopped trying to do any type of movement. I become very rigid in my body. I don't get positive support for that. But I'm very intellectual. I can talk a good game, I can figure stuff out, I get positive support for that. So what do? I leave aside that side of things, and instead I start working on the intellectual side, and I super develop that side. That's what these people refer to as working on your strengths and ignoring your weaknesses. And they say the tetsujin, on the other hand, not only continues to work on their strengths, but they really focus on their weaknesses and start developing those. And they say that's the difference between our style of martial arts or human development and many other styles, is we don't just work on our strengths, which is what we want to do, but on our weaknesses, the things that we're not good at, the things that we feel embarrassed by, the things that we're weak in, the things we do not get positive support from the environment for. And so that's a very important aspect of this as well. So, to bring this little conversation all together, the overall idea here is that when we look at sacred geometry, to me sacred geometry is more than just a set of shapes and patterns. Sacred geometry is the study of all of the patterns and all of the ways that Spirit creates the world. And that connects to also our capacity to incarnate as a conscious spiritual being in the physical world through a physical body. Because to be honest, for the vast majority of us, we all have particular things that are blockages to us in our physical, energetic, and emotional bodies that have to be worked through. And that's just accepted today. We kind of figure out in metaphysics, you got to do some emotional process work if you're going to get to the goal. We all have our stuff that we have to deal with. But in doing that, we can understand that there is a whole process of incarnation to be fully present in the world, that if we don't do every aspect of it, particularly working on our weaknesses, we will never be able to be fully incarnated in the body in the world, and we can never fully experience the pleasure of life. So to tie this back in to something we mentioned before, when we learned in biogeometry to detect these different qualities of nature with the length of the string or with the angle on a pendulum, and we found out that these different qualities of energy really exist in the world and that we can directly detect them. For me, what is the next stage to connect to that as we go from the outside aspect of it to analyze to the internal aspect of it to experience is to get to the place where we then become aware that there are all these energy qualities around us all the time and develop our energy bodies to be able to perceive all those energy qualities all the time directly. So when you're out in nature, instead of it being a very truncated experience, all those energy qualities are around us in nature all the time. And that's an aspect of developing this body of light. And the same thing when we do the movement practices. It's to help us move toward the body of light. Observe the places where you're restricted in your motion or your movement. Observe the times when you get caught in the head and analysis instead of dropping into the experiential of what am I feeling in the energy body. Instead of just thinking about a line of light, am I actually experiencing that line of light? Am I actually able to move carried by that line of light? So that's the overall thing I wanted to mention to start with this morning. Just an overall context for this, because one of our ideas on the opening weekend was that sacred geometry is also a path of initiation. And so that's what I would like to open the door to you for. You won't necessarily use sacred geometry or understand it even the way that I understand it. I just want to offer to you what I can offer, what I do perceive. But for that to hopefully be the opening of a door for how you can start working with this to help to actualize your own potential, actualize your own life. And I personally believe we all have a particular spiritual mission in the world, something that if we don't do, other people will suffer. And so the more that we can get toward actualizing that spiritual mission, the better off we're all going to be. So I'll get off my soapbox now, and we'll start with our slides, working with this very important pattern of the patterns of life itself, which is the phi ratio and the Fibonacci series. If I could get the lights turned out. So this morning, working with Jane, you did some work on the phi ratio. You worked on creating the very important form of the pentagon, pentagram, and the golden rectangle, and the golden spiral. One of our goals in this course is that when you leave, you will have a basic literacy in core terms and patterns in sacred geometry. You will know what all these different things are. So the phi ratio, also known as the divine proportion, also known as the golden proportion, and for those of you that took the biogeometry course, you know from that this golden proportion of the phi ratio and the golden spiral actually was originally called the golden proportion, although this information was hidden from the public, because it generates the higher harmonic of gold energy. It generates the BG3. So golden proportion is used in Egyptian biogeometry, and I'll show you in a little bit that this and similar series were used in ancient Egyptian times because it generates this beneficial energy quality. And in fact, the way that I look at the golden proportion, the divine proportion, phi ratio, different names for the same thing, is that this particular pattern is related to the way that dynamic life energy manifests in the world. And so, very important pattern indeed. Now, one of the basic ideas with the divine proportion is that if you take a line and you cut it at the golden cut location, it cuts the line in such a way that the shorter line from the cut is in proportion to the longer line in the exact same proportion as the entire line is to the longer proportion of the line. So this particular relationship is extremely important. There's a particular type of balance there, so that one of the ideas is that if you had made the cut exactly in the center, that's a balance point, but there's the aspect of it that it's more static. by making the cut at a place that is off-center, you actually bring things into motion. Very important idea behind this golden cut aspect. The reason why it's not exactly in the center. By having it off-center, things come into motion in a particular way. But at the same time, it is perfectly balanced because the shorter part of the line is to the longer part of the line as the longer part of the line is to the entire line. So that's a very important thing to understand about the nature of this particular ratio. So this is part of that thought form in the mind of God. I am making the cut off-center, creating a proportion that is off-center, but in so doing it, I'm still balancing it because of the relationship of the parts to the whole. And also bear in mind that this particular ratio of 1.618 ... to 1 is also expressed as 1 plus the square root of 5 over 2. And the only thing you need to understand about that right now is that this phi ratio is very close to the square root of 5 form that we looked at the other day, which is why the phi ratio gives you a perfect form of a pentagram, and the square root of 5 tends to generate these slightly squashed pentagram forms. We also have seen in the work that we did in generating the root rectangles that if we take the basic form of the square itself and then we cut it in the center to create two rectangles, and we then make this movement in the diagonal from this halfway point and putting the compass up here, and then we make the arc down, that this actually gives us the golden proportion. Now remember that what we did with these particular root rectangles, I connected to the idea of the squared circle. That we have the initial form of the square, and then using the compass allows us to create an arc or a circle, and the union of this created the square root of 2, square root of 3, square root of 5, the three golden or three divine roots from the Pythagorean tradition. And also here, by coming to the center point and drawing it down, we then get the golden proportion. Now one thing I should mention about this is that we normally deal with the phi ratio and its numerical value as 1.618, because the basic ratio is 1 to 1.618 when we measure the two parts of a line that are in proportion to each other. But it's actually part of an entire series that goes from 0.618 to 1 to 1.618, and then it goes further to 2.6 to 4.2 and on through an entire series. We're not going to deal with the larger parts of the series right now because this is a foundation training, but I want you to understand the basic parts of it. So just like we saw in the division of the line, that the golden cut is related to the idea of the relationship of the parts to the whole, so also it's related to the squared circle in the way it can be generated from the basic divided square, and creating the circular arc gives us the 1.618 off the basic baseline. This is a study of the proportions of the head in a particular part of the Temple of Luxor in Egypt. And this is from the work of Schwaller de Lubitz, and I've mentioned de Lubitz multiple times, and he's mentioned as well in your resource guide. If you look at the books of de Lubitz, particularly his masterwork, the big, heavy 2-volume set that was his life's work, called The Temple of Man, they are full of analyses of structures in ancient Egypt, things on the temple walls, the actual temples themselves, all kinds of things. And he shows the particular sacred geometries behind them. And he particularly shows the relationship to things like the phi ratio, which is all over his work. So just to give you one particular example, he does an analysis of the outline of this particular head, which is very interesting because it shows this kind of energy tunnel in the head, this third eye tunnel, and then shows you this uraeus coming out as an energy form for the front for spiritual vision. And it shows the way that it's actually based on particular proportions related to phi. 1 divided by phi, 1 divided by phi squared to the 1, so that if you're understanding the actual sacred geometry, you can analyze these forms in Egypt and see the phi ratio was used in many of the proportions. So we talked a second ago about the way that we could create this golden proportion by getting the square, putting part of the compass at the halfway point, the other at the diagonal, drawing the arc down, and this would then be 1 to 0.618, when the whole thing would be 1.618. And then in the work you did just a minute ago in building the form with the Zoom tools and then doing the arcs with the compass, we saw that First of all, what you're creating, once you make it into a rectangle, is what's known as the golden rectangle, or the phi rectangle, and that it's possible to then proportion it off into these particular square forms. So the overall part of it is a golden rectangle. Then the sections like this are a golden rectangle. Then this section is a golden rectangle, etc., etc. And the parts themselves are squares. And sometimes this is called the series of whirling squares. As you saw in drawing then the arcs, you can connect up the entire thing to create a golden spiral, a very important form that you see throughout nature, classically represented in forms like those of seashells. We mentioned before that the simplest life forms show the geometries in their pure form. When we talked about the way that the Greeks taught the icosahedron is the form connected to water, and water is the basis of life, and then we look at the form of a virus, and it's a pure icosahedron. Then by the same token, with these seashells, they give you the pure form of the phi ratio spiral in their actual architecture. So this particular pattern is something you see as one of the most important patterns in sacred geometry. And it and the golden rectangle is a foundation for sacred architecture for thousands of years. Now, one aspect of this that I try to keep in mind is that in the ancient world they understood that the building was supposed to be something that to a certain extent is alive. And so one way to help to make it alive, in addition to tying it into the earth grid itself that we discussed before, is to use the actual proportions of life for it. Because as we're going to see, this phi proportion that we're talking about, the golden ratio, is also the same pattern that is used for creating the form of the human body, plants, etc. It is really the proportion of life. So this is from Bruce Rawls's Sacred Geometry Design Sourcebook, and he brings together 12 golden ratio spirals, clockwise and counterclockwise, etc. And so what you can see is when these things are brought together, the kind of matrix, the kind of whirling spiral vortex pattern that it makes when these spiral patterns overlap. And another thing to keep in mind is that the golden spiral, if you were to take it into 3 dimensions, would become a golden helix, and could become a form that is related to a vortex. And so I think of it in terms of the golden spiral as not just a 2-dimensional thing, but a 2-dimensional image for a 3-dimensional vortex geometry that is the vortex form that is tuned to bringing etheric life energy into manifestation in the world. This is an analysis of fish, and it shows the golden section rectangles that are connected to the actual form of the fish. This is of a trout, and in this case showing it in the form of a blue anglefish. So whether it's multiple golden rectangles or a single golden rectangle, many living forms are based on this basic design. This is from a particular study that was done where they wanted to find out what forms people aesthetically preferred. What is beautiful to you? The golden proportion is classically known as the proportion of beauty, because once the ancient temple teachings got into architecture, and that was taught to some degree, they kept some of the sacred knowledge, but they didn't necessarily teach the esoteric knowledge behind it. So they might call it the golden proportion, but they never told a person that that's because it actually generated the higher harmonic of gold. That information's only become public through the work of Dr. Ibrahim Karim in Cairo. But there's this understanding that this is a pattern that is related to patterns in nature, and it is a proportion then of beauty. And so with this particular test that they did, they had people look at different forms of squares and rectangles, and they then would say which one they found the most beautiful. And they didn't know anything about the actual measurements of them, etc. Just which do you like the best? And so this is the outcome of it, that by far the highest number of people liked the golden section, the particular golden rectangle, more than any of the others. And you can see the way that it spikes here and then goes back down. So it's something that we're actually wired, we're tuned to perceiving is beautiful. We know it in an innate kinesthetic sense as something related to life itself. And so we often see this connected to the form of the human body. Here's a little golden section analysis, golden rectangle of the form of Vitruvian Man by Leonardo da Vinci. And classically, we often see depictions in sacred geometry text of the different 5-proportion cuts in the human body. One of the primary ones being this one that occurs around the position of the navel. And of course, this golden rectangle is a major form in art. So here, in a variety of forms by Leonardo da Vinci and Vincent van Gogh and Botticelli, etc., we can see the way that they used the golden rectangle, or golden proportion sections, in creating the form of the art itself. And here we have an analysis of the Temple of Ammon from Egypt, again from the work of Schwaller de Lubitz, where he breaks this down. He calls it the Temple of Man, the Temple of Luxor, and he shows the relationship to the phi ratio of the proportioning in the building itself. Again, this is all through de Lubitz's work, where he really demonstrated that the ancient Egyptian temple science really understood the phi ratio and constantly applied it in their structures and even their illustrations. Here in this analysis of the Parthenon, we also see that it's based on the form of a golden rectangle. And this is a kind of thing that you see in many art books where they show the decomposition of the Parthenon into the parts of the golden rectangle. And here, of this particular cathedral, the entire thing is based on the form of a golden rectangle, and particular sections within it are also based on golden rectangles. And the other day, Jane mentioned Le Corbusier, which was the pen name for a particular architect in Europe who was very influential in the beginning of the last century. Le Corbusier actually wrote a series of books where he recommended that architecture get back to using the golden proportion as the basis for essentially all architecture. And he suggested a system called the modular. And the modular was basically a set of proportions of one form to the next form that were all connected to golden proportion. And so that way architects would have an easy system of finding the right cuts, the right proportions to build into any building based on the modular system. And Le Corbusier's books are still available, and he's still very well known in architectural circles. This is the analysis of a villa that he illustrated in his book, Towards a New Architecture. And again, of course, it's based on the form of the golden section, golden rectangle. And you'll sometimes find that in this type of architecture, that not only is the overall form of the building or a part of the building based on the golden rectangle, but also things like the door or the windows, etc., will be based on golden rectangles. Interesting thing about this is that if the modular had actually caught on, which unfortunately it did not, then today if you went to a place like Home Depot and you bought building equipment for your house and you're going to build a house, all the lumber would be cut into golden proportion sections. The same way as your Zoom toolkit that you're working with has all the blue sticks in golden proportion to each other, which is why you can easily stick them together to make the form of a golden rectangle with the blue sticks in the Zoom toolkit. So it's unfortunate that didn't catch on, but perhaps we still have a chance. There's another form of the golden triangle that I believe Jane just covered with you. And one aspect of the golden triangle is that it actually is the triangular faces, the triangular tops that you get to the pentagon in the center of a 5-pointed star. So the actual projections off of the center of the 5-pointed star are themselves golden triangles. So in the studies that you will sometimes find in sacred geometry, they'll talk about the golden triangle, and they will show you the basic form. Sometimes it's used simply by itself or in a particular set of whorls to make the form of a spiral. But again, it's also connected to the form of the 5-pointed star, which is a very important form. There's also the thing that you might see sometimes, which is the golden section ellipse. The golden section ellipse is basically like the egg-shaped form that you would get inside of a golden section rectangle. So we dealt with egg-shaped form the other day, but actually there's a number of forms that could fit an egg-type geometry, an ellipse. And so one of them is actually based on the phi ratio because it would fit inside a golden section rectangle. So if one was experimenting with different egg shapes to cast minerals into, for example, to work with earth healing or for other types of energetic work, then this might be one of the optimal forms to try casting it into, the egg shapes to use to create the optimal energetic. Or if you're cleaning a body of water and you then put the cast forms of the egg in it that the water will run by, whirl into the form of the vortex to cleanse itself, again, this might be an optimal form. And this shows the golden section triangle inscribed inside of the ellipse. Now there's another aspect of this as well, which is that within the 360 degrees of the circle, because you have the 5 divisions of the circle to make the form of the 5-pointed star, you get particular harmonics based on that, which is based on the division of 360 into 5, which gives you 72 degrees in the movement from one arm to the next arm. And we're going to be dealing with these numbers more starting tomorrow, because these are actually very important. The number's 72, and then if you move to the next arm, you come to 144. These are very important numbers, and you'll see them appearing time and again. And there's major parts of your handout for these last 5 days that deal with some of these numbers, but be aware that some of these numbers do occur as you're moving around the perimeter. And this shows you the form that, again, you often see in sacred geometry texts, where you have this kind of fractal form of all golden triangles, but put together into a particular form where they connect to each other, and they can be connected the way you did with the rectangle and the squares earlier today to make the form of a golden spiral. So one of the remarkable things about the 5-pointed star, because we said the 5-pointed star is really the revelation of the phi ratio, is that in its perfect form, it gives you the perfect phi ratio, which we said was 0.618 to 1 to 1.618 to 2.618, etc. on up the series. And so what you find here is that the center line here at 0.618 then gives you the exact value of 1 for the arm, and then the arm and the center together give you 1.618 to the 1 here. And if you add that in, you get the next number in the series, which is 2.618. So again, the entire thing, a 5-pointed star, is a star form that is perfectly divided to give you the phi ratio with any combination of the sections of the lines. Very, very important, because if this is actually the form that nature uses to move life energy, then that means that the 5-pointed star is the star form that is most tuned to life energy or etheric energy itself. And that's one reason why you see the 5-pointed star through magical and spiritual work throughout the world in virtually every culture in so many different applications. This is also illustrating what I mentioned to you before, that in the 360-degree enclosure of the form, from one arm of the 5-pointed star to the next is 72 degrees. And again, if you would actually make the movement of a 5-pointed star, you don't actually connect from point to point to point. If you did that, you'd make a pentagon. But to make the star form, you actually go and you skip one. So you move from here to here to here. You did this with your body, with Elizabeth in the eurythmy, to actually experience it kinesthetically, that movement through the points to make a 5-pointed star. And so in making this particular movement, you're actually connecting an arc of 144 degrees with every movement. And as we'll see later, 144 is a very important number, which many of you are familiar with already from things like the Bible and talking about 144,000, things like this. So this form of the 5-pointed star is related to the phi ratio and to many forms in nature. This is an illustration of particular geometric bases of the 5-pointed star, then being applied to the analysis of plants, because many plants directly reveal the 5-pointed star in the construction and the placement of their leaves, for example. Basic form of construction. In fact, this type of pentagonal geometry, this 5-sided geometry, is one of the hallmarks of something that is alive, whereas one of the hallmarks of something that is of a mineral nature is that it's 6-sided. So 5-sided for nature, 6-sided for things that are of a mineral nature. And the 5 and 6 then work together in a particular way that we'll show you in just a minute. Now, one of the remarkable things about the actual structure of the 5-pointed star, which people in the Pythagorean school really appreciated and found magical, because they had that knowledge that these patterns are thought forms in the mind of God that form the blueprint behind everything in our world, when they saw the five-pointed star, again, it's a revelation because within the form of the pentagon is an upright five-pointed star. And inside the five-pointed star, in its exact center, is an inverted pentagon, which holds an inverted pentagram, five-pointed star, which holds a right-side-up pentagon, which would hold a right-side-up pentagram, which would hold an inverted pentagon, etc., in a constant fractal series into the center. And so that itself could be thought of as a whirling vortex form going into its own center. Also, the entire thing can be decomposed in the form of a pentagon so that you have multiple five-pointed stars. Here's one pentagon with the five-pointed star, then that actually overlaps into the next larger pentagon holding a five-pointed star. And the whole thing is made up of this fractal five-pointed star series within the larger five-pointed star of the entire construction. Now there's a particular form that is sometimes called Pythagoras' lute because it is a particular growing or diminishing form of stars in the way that they fit together. And so if you get this form of the five-pointed star in a pentagon, then the one right next to it fits in to this arm, so that what this means is that this particular line on the outside edge of the large pentagon then becomes one of the interior lines of the pentagram within the next pentagon. And so it continues all the way down in an infinite fractal series. And so this connects the cosmic spaces to the microscopic spaces as a constant growth and diminishing movement in scale. But the form stays perfect regardless of scale, which is one of the great principles of core forms in sacred geometry. The toroidal energy movement at the atomic level is the same as the toroidal energy movement at the cosmic level. Now this brings us to the very important concept that many of you are already familiar with, which is that the particular shape of the phi ratio is related to a series of numbers that are classically known as the Fibonacci series, or the Fibonacci ratio. So that the Fibonacci series of numbers is based on a particular progression. And that is essentially where you start with the number 1. And starting with the number 1, you add to the next number in the series, which is 1. And so 1 plus 1 equals 2. Then you get 1 plus 2. You just simply add the next two numbers in the series. 1 plus 2 equals 3. Then you're going to add 2 plus 3 to give you 5. Then next two numbers in the series are 3 and 5 gives you 8. 5 and 8, 13. 8 and 13, 21. 13 and 21, 34. So this gives you a series of numbers. 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, 55, 89, back to our old friend 144. Very important sacred number. And it continues on from there. And the thing is that when you actually examine nature, nature uses the Fibonacci numbers all the time. Because if nature is going to create something in whole numbers, meaning that it's not going to create 0.618 of a leaf, it's going to create a whole leaf. So if you're going to create a series of things that are whole numbers, if you have a particular series of leaves, they all have to be 1 in and of themselves. How are you going to use the golden proportion in things that are only whole numbers and not these fractions like the golden proportion itself is? And that is that you can then approach the golden proportion by using particular whole numbers in particular combinations. And so you get closer and closer to the phi ratio, the 0.618, the further you go up this series. At first you're a little bit away from it. The way that this is done is that you basically divide one number by the next number within a particular addition, so that where you get 2 plus 1, you would then instead do 1 divided by 2. That gives you 0.5. We're still a good way away from it. The 2 plus 3 is now 2 divided by 3. And 0.666 is what you get. We're still a good bit away from it. Then as you continue up the series with every one of the sequential numbers, 5 divided by 8, 8 divided by 13, 13 by 21, 21 by 34, then you start getting closer and closer to it. 6.619, 617. Now you come to 0.618 with 34 divided by 55. 55 by 8 and 9. And then particularly once you get to 89 divided by our magic number of 144, you've got 0.618. Now all the decimals that run after it are not perfect phi ratio, but boy, it's close enough when you come to the 0.618. And then as you continue through the series. So that explains the way that these whole numbers work together to give you the phi ratio, because we have to find a way in certain types of design to use not just the fractions of the phi ratio, but things in whole numbers, particularly in nature and with life in the world. So that's why we say that the Fibonacci series and the phi series are very, very closely connected. Because if we look at something like the whorls of the pods within the head of the sunflower plant, what you actually find is that they will normally be in a proportion of, let's say, 34 to 55, or 55 to 89. They're in a particular proportion to each other that is in Fibonacci. So you might have 34 running counterclockwise in a spiral, and they're matched by another 55 that are running clockwise. And you could also do a construction of squares similar to what we described before with the phi ratio, but done with the whole numbers of Fibonacci, that would give you the Fibonacci spiral, which is very, very close to the phi spiral. That's what you see here. So again, one is based on this fraction, and the other is based on whole numbers, but the two are really united. So these are various types of plants that you would see in their growth patterns. And what you find is that the bifurcations as the plant grows are based on Fibonacci numbers. It mentions that this particular one here, the sneezewort plant, displays Fibonacci numbers in the count of its stems and leaves as it grows. So from 1 it goes to 2, and from 2 it goes to 3, and the whole thing continues to progress in a Fibonacci series. Now this also works in a particular way as plants develop as they move upward in a get exposure to the sun. This then leads to them being spaced at a particular distance from each other, and one of the classical aspects of this is what's sometimes called the golden angle of 137.5. So this golden angle is another part of this whole golden series, with 137.5 is something you find in many plants in the actual distance within 360 degrees of the circle, that the leaves will be 137.5 away from each other. There are other phenomena too related to golden angle, but just be aware of it as a concept. So this is an illustration of Fibonacci within the form of a pine cone. So the way that this is described within the work of Victor Schauberger is that if you take a look at the way that the lines of energy are running in the actual construction, you would have then these 5 lines running downward with what he would call the descending male forces. And then you would have the 8 lines running upward with the fertilizing ascending female forces. So again, 5 to 8. Again, there are innumerable examples of this Fibonacci ratio in plants and in nature in many different books that you can find out there on sacred geometry. So this particular proportion of numbers was also used in sacred design and sacred architecture. This is actually outside of Chephrun's pyramid at Giza, and there's a temple right next to it. Now this particular illustration, and another one or two that's after it, come from this great book by Alexander Bodaway that I mentioned to you the other day. Alexander Bodaway was the person I mentioned who was a professor at the University of Southern California that wrote a fantastic book on ancient Egyptian harmonic design. And it was Bodaway's book on ancient Egyptian harmonic design that really brought into academia some of the ideas that for the general public de Lubitz had talked about before. In fact, some of de Lubitz's supporters today, people like John Anthony West, who some of you are familiar with as a modern kind of rogue Egyptologist talking about esoteric aspects of ancient Egypt, will cite the book by Bodaway as the academic support for these esoteric ideas. Unfortunately, this book by Bodaway, Ancient Egyptian Harmonic Design, is very, very hard to find and quite expensive when you can find it. It took me about 1.5 years to find a copy, and then it cost me a fair sum of money. So at Vesica, we're now making available copies of it for people that are interested, because it's a very important text, particularly if you're involved in design or interested in the way in ancient Egypt they use these patterns. So with this particular diagram, he showed that there was a pattern of cuts or proportions in the way that this mortuary temple in front of the pyramid had been laid out. And because of the smallness of the image, and you might be sitting a bit further back, he's got numbers in the Fibonacci series running up here. There's 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, 55, then 89, then 144, that are showing the particular proportioning of the temple based on Fibonacci series. And there's illustrations like this all through the works of Alexander Badaway. This is a good one here. This is the plan of the sanctuary at Amarna. And Amarna was the major mystery center of the pharaoh Akhenaten, who many of you are familiar with. So at the sanctuary of the great temple at Amarna, he shows the way that there's a proportioning that takes place. Here we have the 5, the 21, 34, 55, 89, 144 to the overall design proportions. And then in other aspects of it, he also shows it. Here's 34 to 55, for example. So all over it are Fibonacci proportions in the designing of the temple. He also talks about some other patterns that we're not going to get into in this course because they're a little more advanced. But he talks about particular triangular forms that he calls the 1 to 2 triangle and the 2 to 4 triangle, etc., that are harmonic triangles that are so connected to ancient Egyptian design. But what we're concerned with right now is how he demonstrates the use of the Fibonacci numbers in laying out the parts of the temple. Now again, this is similar to what Gilbert pointed out very commonly using the phi ratio to examine ancient Egyptian design. Because again, these are the ratios of life itself. And in ancient Egypt, when they would create a temple, they had that ceremony we showed you on our first day called the stretching of the cord ceremony. Let's remember that the stretching of the cord ceremony was, from my analysis of it, this is just coming from me, when you start with holding the cord in its center, you connect to the 0 point, you connect to zero dimensionality, and then from the 0 point, from the center, we have the creation out into space, and that's where you see the stretching of the cord with Tehauti, or whom the Greeks called Thoth, stretching the cord out to create the first axis or dimension of space, and then the other axes coming from it. And with that stretching of the cord, the creation of a sacred space, this would progress in a series until you'd completed the temple, and there would be a ritual called handing the temple over to its master, which would be an actual invocation of the spiritual beings that the temple had been built for to move into the temple as a dwelling place. And so again, there's multiple concepts here. They tied the building into the earth grid so that the earth's own life energy moved into and infused the building. They built the overall proportions based on the life proportions for living things like plants, which again is Fibonacci and phi ratio. And then they would do other things with it as well, related to things we discussed in biogeometry with energy qualities, like the higher harmonic of ultraviolet, higher harmonic of gold, the BG3, etc., to make it a place of life and vital energy, and also the energetics to connect strongly to spirit. This is an analysis that comes from the work of Gilbert again in his book Temple of Man. I want to tie it back into our concept of the net. I believe the practice that you're going to be doing as probably our final compass practice of the course is going to be later today with the groups in the afternoon in drafting the net, the Greek net, with Jane, while the other group is working with Elizabeth. And so this is an actual analysis of the use of the net in illustrations such as this. In this particular illustration in ancient Egypt, they sew these particular netters working with the pharaoh or with the initiate with a net, in this case to catch the birds. Well, the thing to bear in mind when you're studying these depictions in Egypt is that they will commonly use the picture of the net. Now, they did use nets in ancient Egypt to catch birds and to catch fish, etc. But the reason why they call them the masters of the net, and they show spiritual initiates holding nets saying that they are catching and casting magic, is related to this blueprint of sacred geometry that we have discussed. Because what is commonly done is that you take some reference in the physical world that people would recognize that is similar to the spiritual phenomenon that you are discussing, and then use that as a metaphor in the art or in the literature for the thing that the initiate knows about. And so here the netters are pulling tight the net, the matrix of energy that things are caught in. Because if you read some of the text associated with this, they're not talking about catching actual fish. Instead, in the place that they show the catching of fish, they describe the catching of human souls in the afterlife. The same sort of thing with the birds in the net. If you take a look at the depiction of the human astral body in ancient Egypt, it is of the body of a bird with the head of the human being, because the astral body can leave the body and fly like a bird, which is what we call astral projection. So this catching in the net is also related to what I discussed in the beginning, that if you read chapter 153 of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, it's a detailed description for the person who is either the initiate passing through the spiritual spheres, or for any human being after death, to identify all the parts of the net. And every part of the net is associated with a particular netter, with a particular spiritual being or force. And so it's a remarkable description of all the parts of the net that they said you had to know to not get caught in it. Because what I see as the parallel of this is that in more modern esoteric texts, the way it would be described is that if a person has not fully developed their spiritual faculties of perception while they're here on earth, if they have not developed their spiritual sight so that they can perceive non-physical realities, then there can be the problem that after death, particularly if they don't direct their soul to the correct location, the way that's described in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, where at the moment of death you need to direct your soul to the correct place, then what can happen is that the person is somewhat deaf, dumb, and blind in the spiritual world. They have to be assisted from place to place. The person can get caught in the net. They can get caught in what the Tibetans might call a hell realm, and they have to be assisted from those realms to go to the correct destination. And so to not get caught in the net, you have to know the geometry of the net. You have to know every part of the net. You have to know the matrix, the layout. And so in this analysis of one of the nets that he saw depicted on the temple walls in Egypt, he shows that the entire net was proportioned according to Fibonacci proportions, 34, 55, throughout the entire structure of it. So again, without knowing these aspects of sacred geometry, without knowing the principles of sacred geometry and the particular patterns, it'd be hard to fully understand many of these ancient traditions and how they actually did their practical work. Now this leads us to our larger topic, where having looked at the basic proportions of the phi ratio and Fibonacci and getting some understanding of that, we then move to the larger concept of two-dimensional geometries in general. So this is a depiction of the movement from geometry of the one to that of the two, where it's simply divided, to that of the three, where then we can divide it into three and create the form of a triangle. This is why we say that the triangle is the minimum form that can contain space with straight lines. In two-dimensional space, the minimum straight form is that of the triangle, which is very important, and we're going to get to more details on tomorrow when we deal with the Platonic solids and the ideas of Buckminster Fuller about how everything is constructed. And we're going to see that it was Buckminster Fuller's ideas related to the geometries of creation that later opened the door for modern technology like nanotechnology. All modern nanotechnology is actually based on the structural ideas of Buckminster Fuller, which is why they call their creations things like buckyballs or Buckminster Fullerene, to give homage to him, because it's through his work they figured out how you can structure matter at the molecular level to create anything, molecule upon molecule. So we're entering into this nanotechnology revolution. Then from the three, we get the four. We get the form of the square, or we can divide it into four parts, as you commonly see in many different spiritual traditions depicting the four directions. Then the five with the pentagon, or the five-pointed star, the 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, etc., all through the series. So as we go through this combination of numbers, as we go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6, we then find that they can then create these particular shapes. And so it really is a system where you cannot separate the number and the shape itself. They're integrally connected. Just as we found that particular shapes related to the phi spiral, for instance, are connected to the number series of the Fibonacci numbers when they are put together in particular combinations. Okay, next slide. Now this then leads to an understanding of what in this case is called the grammar of Yantra. Now this is a very fascinating topic. I've got a handout for you, which we should refer to now, because I want to draw your attention to it. In your handout for this 5 days of the course, that... 49. Ah, you found it already? Excellent, thank you. On page 49 of the second set of handouts that you got, there's a handout that's called Sacred Science of the Yantra and Mandala. And this clarifies that the yantra is a Sanskrit term for geometric patterns related to divine beings and energies, and there's a complete system in India for working with these patterns. It's very highly developed. They use this for spiritual development, meditation, and for healing purposes. And so in this particular article, I'm not going to go over all of it with you in class. I won't use the time for that, but you can read it on your own time. I talk about some of the very important aspects in India of how they work with these patterns of the yantras and how this all comes together. Now, one of the very important aspects of this is that from their perspective, they don't worship the yantra in what they or some parts of Western traditions would consider worshiping it like a graven idol. Rather, they use it as a kind of a meditation matrix. They use it as something that actually shows the pattern of energy of something that they're going to resonate with, something they're going to connect with. This is similar to many things in esoteric Buddhism, where you don't necessarily worship the Buddha, you become the Buddha figure that you are connecting to in resonance. And so it's a matter of becoming rather than worshiping from afar. And this is also an idea that we use in biogeometry, where in biogeometry we reference the concept that Ibrahim Karim and the other Egyptians that work with them will often say, which is that for us, communication is becoming. So communication with, in that case, the netters is a matter of becoming the netters. It's a matter of resonance with these beings. And the same thing here. It's a matter of resonance with the energy pattern held within the yantra, rather than what we might think of as a type of outside worship of the pattern itself. Now, there's a particular key to using the yantra that I mentioned in this article, which is a practice of insertion of the breath. And this insertion of the breath into the pattern is to infuse divine life energy into the yantra itself. And that's what makes it effective. So there's the whole concept of activation of the pattern that's very important in many different traditions. The pattern itself already has some intrinsic energy to it. It's already an energy pattern of a particular kind. But it might be similar to having an electronic device that you haven't plugged in yet. But when you plug it in, then it really works. It's already got the pattern in place, but it's got to get plugged into the energy source. So this activation of the pattern is something that is very important. And so with that activation, it's similar to what we described the other day with resonance, in which if you had two tuning forks, if you don't strike either tuning fork, neither one will resonate. But if you strike the first tuning fork and bring it close to the second one will resonate too. And this is that activity that's referred to in biogeometry as linkage, in which we can connect two particular things together that are of a similar energy quality to exchange energy and information. So one aspect of this, and there's many aspects to the work with the yantra, it's a huge science in India, is that the pattern in the yantra is one potential pattern of energy and consciousness within the human being, because the human being is the crown of creation. We have all those patterns potential within us, or that we can resonate with as different functions within us. And so by activating it, we then begin to activate its pattern within us. That's why they say we don't worship it, but rather, in a sense, we become it. We identify with it, we resonate with it, and we begin to be able to use its particular functions and its patterns for ourselves. Then I go on to mention other things here. Again, I'll let you read it in detail for yourself about the yantra, mantra, and jnana, so that these are often particular sets of things, where in this case, with the jnana, mantra, and yantra, it's connected to working with the pattern, working with the sacred sound, and working with the actual state of consciousness that's connected with the form. And it's somewhat connected to the idea in Buddhism of thought, speech, and action, etc. So this gives you from I think this is from the wonderful book, Tools for Tantra, that I think we still have a couple of copies of. It's by Harish Johari. There's a number of really good books and resources by Harish Johari for the sacred geometry of the Indian tradition. And it's listed in your resource guide. So what this shows here is that various patterns have various types of meanings within the yantra. And I warn you that these are just one shallow take on a much deeper story. You don't want to be restricted to these interpretations. But they give you some idea of the way that the patterns work together as a whole. So that you have the upward pointing triangle, its dynamic upward movement, fire male, downward movement, water female is the downward triangle. The two come together, and if it's a bit of a stretched form of a six-pointed star, it's a kind of dynamic equilibrium. If it's a perfectly harmonious form of the six-pointed star, which is equilateral triangles for both, then that's static equilibrium. A number of different things here. It has both forms of the swastika. One is clockwise movement of creation. One is counterclockwise movement for dissolution or destruction. So again, they have a complete series of forms that they understand have particular effects. Now at the same time, again, to give it these types of definitions is already a limitation. There's much more to it. But it gives you, again, some idea that there are many layers of interpretation for the yantras, but they are also actually energy blueprints for the patterns that are held within them. And one very important part of it is that in these patterns, very often there will be a point in the very center that's called the bindu point. And it's the emphasis of the center function that we've talked about before for the entire yantra. Now there are other particular sets of numbers that are related to construction of different geometrical forms. So we've just talked about the set of number of the Fibonacci numbers that gives you the particular harmonics related to the phi ratio. Well, there are others that here there are triangular numbers in a particular sequence. 1, 3, 6, 10 work together in such a way that if you work with the numbers 1, 3, 6, and 10, they actually create a triangular form when you put them together. It's also related to a concept the Greeks used called the tetractys. Now if you work with the numbers 2, 6, 12, 20, and you put them together, here's 2, here's 4 making 6, here's another 6 making 12, etc. They come together and they're called rectangular numbers because they would then make the pattern of this rectangular form, as opposed to something like square and cubic numbers, where you have particular numbers of square faces making a two-dimensional square form. You can make it with one square and it's balanced. Or 4 squares together is another balanced cube. Or 9 squares together, is another balanced square. Or 9 squares together is another balanced square, etc. So it has to grow in a particular series. Interestingly enough, for we aficionados of the number 16, the next set up would be 4 squares across, 4 squares up, for a total of 16 in a balanced square. Same thing works for cubes. You can have one cube by itself as a balanced cube, or it would take 8 cubes in a series to make the next balanced cube, or 27, 64, again. So these particular numbers have particular meanings. And this particular graph connects it to the proportional rectangles that we worked with, the golden spiral, the Fibonacci, and we're not going to deal right now with the lambdoma. This is a very important series that's related very often to musical harmonics. But I will recommend the book that this comes from, which is a very recent, inexpensive little book that is called The Golden Mean by Scott Olson. And in fact, many of us here have known Scott Olson and worked with him in the past. Okay, lunch. So let's pick up on our next topic here in dealing with two-dimensional forms and their effects. We had shown this diagram during the opening weekend, and many great initiation diagrams have multiple levels to it. Things like the Tree of Life have level after level of meaning associated with it. So one aspect of this is that with this diagram showing the first logos, second logos, third logos, with the 5-pointed star in this case, this comes from one of Rudolf Steiner's texts called An Esoteric Cosmology, that the 5-pointed star here is connected to the microcosm. The 6-pointed star is said then to be the symbol of the macrocosm, and the point in the circle connected to the form of the Godhead. So there's a number of things embedded in this. One is the way that the 5-pointed star geometry is related to life activity, and the 6-pointed star and hexagonal shape to mineral creation. The point in the center of the circle, of course, is connected to the idea of the center, and our first form of sacred geometry, the creation of the world in the form of the sphere by the Godhead, and the center as a transcendental gateway beyond space and time that we talked about before. But the aspect I want to pursue on this right now is about the 5 and 6-pointed stars, which are very important forms that you see in magical and spiritual work of virtually every tradition across the planet throughout time. And one particular aspect of these, which is their connection to the human subtle bodies. If you take a look at this particular yantra from India, it's of the elephant-headed god Ganesh. And Ganesh is a fascinating spiritual being when one studies the background of this being. When I did work with Dr. Sagan of the Clear Vision School, among the spiritual forces that the school works with, in what would seem to people from the outside a rather eclectic selection, is the being of Ganesh. And when you go to the background of this being, this is one of the most beloved beings in the Hindu pantheon. In fact, he is sometimes referred to as the remover of obstacles. The being Ganesh has that as a function, a netter function, to remove obstacles. But if you go further into the story of Ganesh, beyond his beloved aspect within the Hindu tradition, one aspect of which is that they say he doesn't mind if you worship him badly. There are particular spiritual beings that are kind of rigid, like you better do it this way. If you're going to invoke me at all, you better do it just the right way. Ganesh is considered in the Hindu tradition to be an extremely benevolent being, that as long as your intention is okay, you can do it any way you want. You don't have to worry about screwing up the ritual. So a pretty broad-minded being here. But the being of Ganesh is also something that if you then study the beginning of the Vedic tradition, the beginning of the Indian high culture at the time that we have any records of, the beginning of the Vedas, then you find that actually the being Ganesh predates the early Aryan civilization of the Indians in India. That he was actually already one of the deities that was observed and worked with by the people living in the Indus Valley before this particular group of people came in and founded what we think of as the Vedic tradition in India. And in the early stories in India, they refer to Ganesh as one of the 50 victorious gods who defeated the Asuras. There is some very deep spiritual history associated here. Unfortunately, a lot of this spiritual history has gotten obscured in the recent past because there's been so much desire to reinterpret spiritual history according to purely materialistic references, and it becomes something like a Star Trek episode. But in dealing with spiritual forces, and you look at the old Indian Hindu documents, they talk about a particular group of hindering beings called the Asuras, and they were defeated by a group of beneficial beings, and one of the 50 victorious gods who defeated the Asuras was Ganesh. Tremendous background here, so that as we go from abstraction to reality in spiritual work, and even in our understanding of sacred geometry, we then find that the beings depicted in these different traditions are actually real, living, spiritual beings, often of many octaves of greater existence than we have. We're somewhat like an ant compared to the grandeur of these beings. But they can be a guide to the actual existence and function as netters of these beings that people within this tradition have connected to for a long time. One other little note on this is that Dr. Sagan of the Clear Vision School had a particular concept that I found very interesting and a helpful summary, which is that all the different spiritual traditions on the planet are a particular group of human beings and spiritual beings that have come together as a group to perform a particular function. And so it's not that one is right and one is wrong. They're different functions in and of themselves in the groups, just like the different netters themselves have different functions. And so looked at that way, all these different spiritual groups on the planet, when you begin to examine them, when I mentioned before that different spiritual groups will do different spiritual exercises that will sculpt the bodies of their initiates in different ways, that actually then allows the initiate in that group who has done those practices for 20 years whatsoever to do particular types of spiritual activities. They are in a sense training their initiates to perform a certain function in the world. One person might have the function of being a great energy healer. Another might have a function that's more connected to the level of cognition and of concepts, things of that kind. So in looking at these different traditions, there are a particular group of spiritual beings which are always referenced directly in the tradition, and human beings that are connected to it, which can then lead to the whole question of what is my tradition? And for many spiritual seekers, this becomes one of the first questions that has to be asked. What is my core tradition? It may or may not be the tradition that you grew up in. So a person that grew up Irish Catholic might end up later on becoming a Tibetan Buddhist, because that's where they feel they have a spiritual home. They're in resonance with that group better. And so one of these initial questions is, where do I feel spiritually at home? What group speaks in a language or even has an energetic that is comfortable to me? It's something that is natural to me. It's a part of my karma. It's a part of my dharma. It's a part of what I'm here to do in this incarnation and through a series of lifetimes. So really core concepts there. But back to the main topic, looking at this form of the yantra containing Ganesh, there's a particular piece of information embedded in it, and that is that the way that the being Ganesh is depicted, that at the level of the knees is shown a bottom line of the upper triangle, and then toward the head is the point of the upper triangle. Then at the place of the shoulders is the upper line of the downward triangle, then going down to beneath the body. And this is actually depicting a particular energy pattern around the human being, as it is described in the Rosicrucian tradition as well. It's not always brought out in text in a particular tradition, but they will show it in things like iconography. But in the Rosicrucian tradition, they talk about the exact same pattern in the energy field a bit more directly, which is why I say one of the functions of Rosicrucianism is not necessarily to always be a separate tradition, but to interpret older esoteric information, classical information that's gotten lost, into a form that we can understand in our current cultural context. So within the Rosicrucian information is a description of the way that one of the patterns in the human energy body is the six-pointed star form, with the lines of the triangle, the upper line that you see here at the level of the shoulders, and the other one of the other triangle, the level of the knees, is the way that they describe it. The same as you see in the old yantric form in India. And this is the pattern that's described as being connected to the human astral body. And the Rosicrucians say that this particular pattern is a six-pointed star when seen two-dimensionally, and it becomes a three-dimensional form when seen three-dimensionally. This is the pattern that has become popularized in recent times as the star tetrahedron. It is actually a form of the human astral body, and it exists in energetic space around the human being, so that the triangles actually then become tetrahedrons. The five-pointed star, on the other hand, as most of you are familiar with, and we described in the eurythmy work with Elizabeth, is actually the form of the human etheric body, with an actual energetic current from the base of the feet. And remember that in disciplines like Chinese Qigong, they emphasize the K1 point, the kidney point at the base of the feet, as an access point to the earth and anchoring downward. From the base of the feet to the palms of the hand, also very important energy centers, the palms of the hands, and then connecting to the head. So there's an actual circuit of a five-pointed star running through the body. And in the Greek Christian Hermetic tradition, there are particular practices that one does in creating a large five-pointed star over one's body as a protective device. In fact, many traditions work with the five-pointed star as a protective device. If you ask Ibrahim Karim, as a Muslim working in the Egyptian tradition about the five-pointed star, he will say that the quality of the number 5 contained in the pentagram is the quality of protection. And it not only is connected to the form of the pentagram as one form, which is then in resonance with the human etheric body in this five-pointed star current, but even the quality of the number 5 itself has the quality of protection, which is why you will also see amulets that are of the form of a human hand with the fingers like this that are worn around the neck of people in India and elsewhere because of the quality of the numbers of the fingers. So that with the 5 fingers, with it being the quality of protection, that protects the energy center at the hands. Well, we also need to protect the energy center at the feet. So God gave us 5 toes. So 5 being the number of protection and the quality of protection. Just to give you some idea of where this type of investigation leads. So this 5-pointed star that we just looked at in terms of the phi ratio, and it perfectly holding this life encoding within its ratio, is also, once again, empirically present in the form of the human being. And this is what's encoded in things like some of the works of Leonardo da Vinci and classical illustrators when they show the human being in these types of postures, because many of them were initiates of particular groups that knew about the 5-pointed circulation. Or again, for those that would depict the six-pointed star around the body, knowing that it's another energetic form around our energy field connected to the astral body. So understanding this leads to another elaboration. For a lot of things I'm about to go into are things that simply became self-evident to me over time in working with this. There's a lot of pieces of the puzzle that are never connected in different teachings or in different books. So you really have to learn the pieces from different teachers and traditions and books, and then there's a Rosicrucian activity of pulling back from it to see it from a height, see it from a distance, and see the context that it fits in together. And when you do that, you see that actually the pieces fit together in an exquisite way. They're like broken pieces of a mirror that then are put together to make sense. And one of those aspects is the way that the five-pointed star we described is related to life energy. But the five-pointed star is also related to the form of the golden spiral, which in 3 dimensions becomes a form of a vortex that is tuned to life energy itself. And so what you then find is that the form of the five-pointed star is used not only as general protection in a number of spiritual traditions, but also used as a form that is directly traced out as something to either bring energy or spiritual forces in, or to take energy or spiritual forces out. Just like we talked the other day about clockwise and counterclockwise spins with a vortex, to take detrimental energy out or to bring beneficial energy in. And so this comes from the very well-known Golden Dawn tradition in Britain around the turn of the 1800s to the 1900s in London and elsewhere in Britain, and then later with branches in the US and Canada and New Zealand, etc. This particular English lodge of the Golden Dawn was a kind of combination Masonic Rosicrucian lodge, actually started by high-ranking Freemasons, that was intended to do actual spiritual initiation work, because some of these Freemasons in London got tired of just kind of hanging out in fraternal organizations, and they wanted to actually do something of an initiatory manner. So they put together this Golden Dawn Lodge, and they actually got a founding document from a source in Germany. But without going into all the background of it, the basic idea is that for a lot of Western magical work today, most of the stuff that gets referred to and most of the popular text in the West and North America now for Western magic comes straight from the Golden Dawn. It's straight Golden Dawn manuscripts. And one of the ideas from the Golden Dawn group, which included people like William Butler Yeats and a number of luminaries in Britain at the time, was this particular pattern in which they would use the five-pointed star to either invoke spiritual energies that they wanted to come in, or they would use the form of the five-pointed star to banish. And it depended upon the way that they traced the pentagram, whether it was creating a form to bring the energy in or to take the energy out. Like if they were going to clear a space, they might trace the five-pointed star in a particular direction to take the energy out. And so I believe this contains the composite of the function of the five-pointed star as a life function and its activity as a protective device known to many different traditions, and its activity being related to the way the phi ratio is encoded inside of it, which is connected to this golden spiral and this vortex of energy coming in and going out. But you find this type of work of the five-pointed star in many traditions. Here is a Kabbalistic document that's held today in the British Museum, showing the use of the pentagram with circles at the tips of the angles of the pentagram, and then using the names of the archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Haniel, etc. And so this use of this for magical purposes and for protective purposes extends to many different traditions. Now just a very quick comment here on the mystery of the Kabbalistic word, because one of the things that we're exploring slowly, step by step, in the work with Elizabeth in Eurythmy is some deeper initiation knowledge having to do, for instance, with the power of sound and the nature of these particular seed syllables, then the mystery of the Kabbalistic word, where the sound carries a vibration, and the vibration is equal to a function. And we've seen before that the sound is also equal to a particular geometric shape. And so there's a particular mystery related to the sound L. And when you make the sound L with the tongue in the mouth, one thing that we've explored before with Dr. Kareem in advanced biogeometry is that the sound L with the tongue in the mouth, if you test it, can create a BG3 emanation from the mouth. In fact, there is an aspect of higher level biogeometry that deals with the power of the word and has to do with the actual geometry of the way that you put your mouth into a particular shape and the position you put your tongue in. And you'll sometimes see this done by Sufi masters and other masters who will put their tongue in particular positions, and sometimes there'll be no sound coming out, but they're creating a healing vibration by doing this. So just like I have to move my mouth and my tongue to different positions to make all the sounds to speak to you now, when the air runs over the tongue and through the mouth as a cave shaped in different positions, that will create different types of vibrations or energies. And the touching of the tongue to the tip of the mouth creates this BG3 emanation when it's done correctly. So that's the sound L that we get. Also, we mentioned before that touching of the tip of the tongue to the roof of the mouth completes an energetic circuit in the body. The energy up the spine and then going down the front channel of the body. So many things are connected here. But again, working with the Egyptians, this is one thing they've brought out. And what you then find is that the sound L, or even the actual word EL, as we would have it in English, in the ancient Hebrew, this L was the suffix to the name of spiritual beings. That's why the L is at the end of the name of all the great archangels. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, they all end with L. And part of that is the way that it creates a particular vibration of that BG3 with the L itself. Next. So there's a classic tradition that talks about the five-pointed star, the inverted pentagram, being connected to evil. And in black magic traditions, often related to what's known as the goat of Mendes, or the picture of a goat's head, which with its beard at the top and its horn and then the ears creates the form of an inverted pentagram. And unfortunately, a lot of the knowledge of this got lost, so that today fundamentalist Christians and things think that even the form of an upright pentagram is somehow a sign of evil, which there's absolutely no historical justification for whatsoever. But the basic idea of the inverted pentagram is that it has been used for black magic at various times, because it is the inversion of the proper orientation of the five-pointed star with its function. And it's also the inversion of the form of the energy field of a human being. So by inverting the energy field of the human being, all black magic is an inversion of the forces that create health and that help a person in their spiritual evolution. It's what harms a person or that creates disease. And so it's an inversion of the field connected to the five-pointed star. Now you also see the five-pointed star in different types of magical uses. This is a very famous form in magical circles known as the seal of Amet. And Amet is a Hebrew name for truth. This is actually the original waxed tablet that was created in the work of a famous British magician several hundred years ago in Elizabethan England. John Dee was a famous magician who worked with a particular seer who was not a very nice guy named Edward Kelly. And there are very well-known stories in magical circles about the work that John Dee did with Edward Kelly to scry spiritual worlds, and they developed something called the Enochian alphabet, which is a very big topic. But the basic idea there is that they used as a fundamental form for their magical work the seal of Amet that has multiple aspects of sacred geometry in it and also has particular Hebrew letters. And the Hebrew letters don't always connect up in a straight line. They actually connect in a particular flow pattern, one space to the next, to the next, to the next, to create their own geometries. And then you have this particular form of the seven-pointed star containing inside of it the five-pointed star, all containing particular energetics for their work.
Can you spell Amet?
You usually see it put into English as A-M-E-T or A-M-E-T-H. But again, the original is in Hebrew letters. Now the form of the five-pointed star is also something that we have in the formation of the human physical and energy bodies. So we talked about the energy body aspect. Here from the work of Randolph Stone with polarity therapy, one of the forms that they use in polarity therapy out of many different geometric forms to balance the structure of the body is the structure of the body in connecting these points at the hip joints with this position at the base of the spine or here at the throat, and these positions here at the shoulders. So within polarity therapy, this is a particular method of balancing the physical body and its particular points, creating this five-pointed star form. So where we've come to now, that's a little too loud, where we've come to now is an exploration of these particular two-dimensional forms, and particularly the mystery of the 5- and 6-pointed stars. And the last form we looked at is the particular balance in the human body with particular nodal points in the physical body itself used in polarity therapy to balance the physical frame. Now there's something similar that you find as an energetic 5-pointed star in Chinese medicine. That's very important. Because Chinese medicine uses a 5-element theory, you will commonly see in Chinese medical text and medical Qigong text a pentagram made of interactions between the 5 elements: the fire, the water, the metal, the earth, and the wood. And what you find is that there are various types of relationships between these, where according to the way that the patterns connect, one element will support the next one, or it will undermine the next one, or have various types of relationships of one to the other. So this is the sort of thing, the creative cycle, etc., that you find in Chinese medicine, with the way that these 5 elements interconnect with each other, usually shown as a pentagon or pentagram form of energy interactions between the 5 elements. And in eurythmy, Elizabeth has been leading us in this particular practice. Now this practice is said in the Rosicrucian tradition to be linked to some practices done in small Rosicrucian lodges in Europe sometime in the last couple of hundred years, where they would do this particular practice of the light streams downward, weight presses upward, with the form of the 2 triangles interpenetrating. And as Elizabeth has mentioned to us, with the 2 triangles interpenetrating, they cross over each other in that form that we've been making in eurythmy, with the 2 triangles crossing each other so that their points make this type of diamond shape over the area of the heart. And this is related to both the energies from heaven and from earth and their interaction in the human body. So not only is there a 5-pointed star, but in this form it's connected to the 6-pointed star as well, but also to the way that the form of the 6-pointed star, for various types of esoteric work, the 2 triangles are separated from each other and shown in various types of juxtaposition for different types of energetics. For instance, in alchemical works, the representation of fire, air, water, and earth in classical alchemy text are shown as upward triangles for fire and for air, and for water, and a downward triangle for earth. And with the air and the earth, there is this central line right here. And sometimes these are put together to make this form of a 6-pointed star with a line in the center. For that particular representation, there are other texts that you can find in which the water is shown with a downward representation. And in that case, in these different texts, when the water is shown with a downward representation along with earth, then just as the fire with an upward triangle is shown without a line in the center, the water as a downward triangle is shown without a line in the center, and the air and the earth each have the line through the center of upward and downward pointing triangles respectively. And it also suggests in the cases where the alchemical symbols are those, that there is a particular type of relationship then between the fire and the water, and between the earth and the air as polarity pairs. This is from the Golden Dawn Lodge that I told you about this morning, and in addition to them using the pentagram form that I showed you before, they also had a particular well-used ritual called the Lesser Ritual of the Hexagram. Now, the work that they do in the Golden Dawn and the similar types of Western magical lodges is usually based on the Hebrew Kabbalah. And there are particular practices that they would go through where they use the form of the 2 triangles in particular positions for invoking and for banishing, similar to the way that we saw them use the form of the pentagram before. And then they'll bring the two triangles together, which you see in this form here, with different directions for invoking and for banishing. And they will bring them together for other activities to invoke and banish. A lot of this has to do, in this case, having to do with particular things such as the different directions. This is for the east, and this is for the south. And then the two triangles, which are here juxtaposed as a six-pointed star, with particular directions of tracing for invoking or for banishing. Here, clockwise triangle here, clockwise triangle here, to invoke, to banish, then counterclockwise here and counterclockwise here. Then for the west, they separate the two triangles again into two different positions, with an upward triangle here and the other one facing the opposite direction here. So looking at the two different triangles as a polarity pair that can be brought together into different configurations related to the energetics of the four directions, with the four directions being these primary energies that are used in multiple spiritual traditions. In most native traditions, there are particular ways of working with the four archetypal directions, and there are different energetics for all four directions. Many traditions also then bring in the coarse quarters, where you then have 8 directions. And this then shows that this continues, and now they put together the form of the triangles point to point for invoking or banishing toward the north direction. And so the concept behind this is back to our energy science, particularly for those of you that did the biogeometry, where we showed the idea of the energy key applied on the north-south magnetic lines of the Earth, the energy moving along the magnetic line, and then making this counter-rotating spirals clockwise to the right, counterclockwise to the left. In 3 dimensions, as we've described in this course, it becomes a torus. And so with the different energy qualities for the 4 different directions, then being mirrored by the particular forms that the 2 triangles of heaven and earth are juxtaposed to connect to the energy of that particular direction. And then for invocation and banishment, the triangles are drawn in particular directions to bring the energies in from that direction or to send detrimental energies out from that direction. And so this becomes a more complex system as well, in which then the form of the 6-pointed star then has particular connections to the different planetary forces and particular mantric phrases in Hebrew. And it's very common that often these mantric phrases will be drawn from the Talmud, from the Old Testament, sometimes from the New Testament, these sorts of things. But again, using these particular geometric forms as a base template to then connect to other energetics, in this case the energetics of the planets. This is similar again to our idea in the energy science, the temple science of sacred geometry, in which every element we bring in has its own energy quality. And so we start bringing together multiple elements and joining their energy qualities together to create a specific energetic effect. The same as on a particular biogeometry tool, you'll have an overall shape to it, and then it'll have other patterns, so that the shape itself might give it BG3 energy. Then each pattern has a specific function that leads to the overall function of the form itself. Same way in many traditions, they bring together the energetics of the 6-pointed star with the energetics of the planetary force and the forces coming from the Kabbalistic word of the sounds or flame letters in Hebrew. And so it becomes a particular composite. It becomes a formula of energy to use. And here we see in the Tibetan tradition, in this Tibetan amulet, the form of this interwoven 6-pointed star. And this is a disease-binding charm. This would actually be worn on the body to repel disease using the force of the 6-pointed star. This is one from the Indian tradition. This particular yantra is used to prolong life and to give wealth. Again, having the form of the 6-pointed star in the center, and then the forces of the Sanskrit letters or particular phrases in Sanskrit written in particular geometrical configurations around the center. Did it get frozen? Is it giving you the spinning beach ball of death?
It just gave me this little spinning geometry
long as that's spinning, don't touch anything.
Okay. All right, then it might go to the next.
Did it go too far?
No, it just went to this one. Oh, yeah, it did. Let me go backwards now.
Okay.
To you, which one did you want?
This-
one? No. Oh, where are we? That one right here. Is that what you want?
Yeah. Let's just stay with whatever it gives you. If it's here, we'll stay here. So.
Get ready to change.
Okay. Well, I might have to shift in a second, but in this particular slide, what we see here is once again this pattern of the Yantra for Ganesh with the six-pointed star that we described before. And I wanted to show you this particular concept that particular patterns can appear as projections two-dimensionally from three-dimensional forms. And we describe the way that the form of what's often called the star tetrahedron, which is two tetrahedrons, one down, one up, interpenetrating, uses a form of the Merkava in some modern forms of teaching, can be represented as a six-pointed star in a two-dimensional projection. Well, the same thing is true for the form of what is essentially an octahedron. And again, an octahedron is two pyramids connected base to base. But when it's projected at a particular angle, then that form of the octahedron, which again is this form, but if you tilt it and see through it at a particular angle, then what you'll see is the form of a six-pointed star inside of it. So there's a relationship here in some cases when you see the six-pointed star to that of an octahedron or a star tetrahedron.
Do you want to go back to the previous slide?
No, I'll just describe the previous slide and we'll go to the next one. The previous slide was simply the sign of the outlines of a cube and showing that the form of a six-pointed star actually fits inside of a cube. And the basic idea here is that inside of a six-pointed star, or inside of a cube, I'm not sure if you can see this from where you are, but that inside of this cube in green lines, there's an octahedron in the center, and then it connects with tetrahedrons. If here's the octahedron in the center, then there are tetrahedrons on each face of the octahedron, which is why the original name of the star tetrahedron was that of a stellated or a star form of an octahedron. So in some texts they'll call it the stella octangula, meaning a stellated or a star form or an octahedron. And what you then find inside this form of a cube is the form of a star tetrahedron. There's two tetrahedral forms, one up, one down. Basically, it makes a connection then to all of the 8 corners of the cube with the 8 projected points of the star tetrahedron. And this also becomes part of a greater pattern we'll show you tomorrow with the Platonic solids, which is something that Bucky Fuller discovered, that you could fill all of space either with cubes or with sets of octahedra connected to tetrahedra. And he called it a tet-octa truss. And it would make a support that if you made this, for instance, out of zone tools, with just the blue lines of the cube, you'd find it fall apart pretty easily. But with this form, having the form of the octahedron and the tetrahedrons inside of it, makes the form of the cube extremely strong and solid. So this is actually an aspect of construction in the physical world. Whenever you need to support the form of a cubical structure, you use these tetrahedral structures. Again, the tetrahedron is our very simple form of a 4-sided pyramid with 3 sides on the upper sides and 1 triangle at the base. And this makes the cube form very strong. And so this is also a part of the esoteric construction of the cube that we'll talk about tomorrow when we get into Platonic solids. And since you're going to be making all these Platonic solids yourself starting tomorrow morning, all these forms will make a lot more sense to you then. Talking about the aspect of the 6-pointed star, which is within a hexagon, which is simply a 6-sided enclosure, there's the aspect of it we mentioned before that the hexagon, the 6-sided form, is a key to mineral creation, because mineral forms like crystals tend to take on a 6-pointed form, whereas living things, flowers, human beings, etc., have a form that's connected to the pentagon and the pentagram and the phi ratio. Well, another aspect of this hexagon of creation is a well-known particular type of chemical reaction when you heat up things like particular types of oil. When it heats up, it will self-organize into these cells that are all hexagonal. And if you observe what happens when it then heats up and it breaks up into these hexagonal sections, which fills all of space, then the place in the center actually becomes a 0 point, and the energy of it keeps pouring into the center and back out the sides. So it actually circulates through the center of the hexagon. But it shows the way that with the application of heat, particular substances self-organize into these hexagonal creation forms, and then have an almost toroidal type of circulation of energy and substance through the center, a vortex type of phenomenon. Now, the pentagram and the hexagram, as we mentioned before, are the specific forms connected to the human etheric life body, the pentagram, and the human astral body of consciousness, which is the hexagram. Remember that the hexagram is also what we call the Star of David, sometimes called Solomon's seal. And we find in various contexts the 5 and 6 pointed stars together. One of the classical contexts that you find them together is, if you look, for instance, at the original emblem of Martin Luther with the Protestant Reformation, his form was that of a rose. And if you then look more deeply into what the form of the rose is, of course, the rose is the archetype of a 5-sided or pentagonal geometry. This is part of a classical tradition that you find with the Sufis and, of course, with the Rosicrucians and other groups, where the rose is a representation connected to the power of the 5-pointed star, whereas the form of the lily is connected to the energy and the power of the 6-pointed star. And at that point, it begins to make sense about some of the heraldry and the representation, particularly for noble families in Europe, when they would use the form of the rose and the lily for representing various things. As you begin to study medieval alchemy, various medieval esoteric groups, then this use of the rose and the lily you see all over the place to connect to the 5 and 6 pointed star geometries, because the rose has an archetypal 5-petal pentagonal geometry, and the lily has an archetypal 6-sided hexagonal or hexagram geometry. Now, of course, all of this is related to thought forms in the mind of God. So when we find the actual constructions with the masters of the compass who are rediscovering the actual geometric movements of the great designer, or what the Masons would call the grand architect of the universe, then we find that out of, once again, our form of the Vesica, which we worked with the other day to develop the 3 sacred roots, that from this basis one can also, though we didn't do the exercise here, it's a straightforward practice to create the form of a pentagon connected to the form of a hexagon. So the two are connected in the form of the Vesica, once again as our core template for patterns to come from. And back to the Golden Dawn tradition, the foundation of most Western magical work today, if you look at their particular form of the ceremonial cross that represented their order, you find multiple things in it. One that you'll recognize at this point that you might not have recognized before this course is that toward the center cross here, you have the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet broken up into their groups of 3 and 7 and 12 that we described before from the Sephir Yetzirah. The 3 mother letters, the 7 doubles, the 12 elementals, that we now know is the coding pattern for the human subtle bodies of the physical, etheric, and the astral. But what you also see here is the form of the 5-pointed star and the 6-pointed star. And this is true on the insignia and regalia of multiple esoteric groups and particularly magical groups, that they will always put together, in many cases, the 5 and 6-pointed stars together. And there's also deeper things here having to do with the way that at the points, for instance, a 5 or 6-pointed star, they might have at specific points a particular planet represented, which is part of a deeper esoteric teaching connected to the actual forces working through that pattern. I just want to make a connection to what we started out with on Saturday, with this idea that when we looked at the sacred geometry, the pattern, the net behind the face of this woman, which is actually connected to the archetypal pattern of all human faces, we found the 6-sided enclosure with a 5-pointed star going up and a 5-pointed star going down superimposed with the grid of the particular form of the human face. So what we're seeing now is we're drawing this into connection to another point, which is the way that the 5-pointed star and the 6-sided geometry work together. The two have actually come together in the geometry of the face. So the hexagonal and pentagonal geometry exist in the blueprint of the human face, and we also saw it was the blueprint as well of Jerusalem when we looked at this material on Saturday. And so now we have one aspect of why is the thought form in the mind of God behind the form of the human face connected to the form of the pentagon and the hexagon. Part of it is because they are connected to the core forms of the human etheric life body and the human astral body of consciousness, both of which are expressed through the form of the human face. This comes from one of the speculative texts that there are many of today dealing with landscape geometries, particularly in the south of France. And in this particular text, they are looking at a form that they believe was laid down in the south of France with the form of a 6-pointed star connected to that of a 5-pointed star, with particular nodal points for particular types of locations. And there's a growing number of these types of text out today, and I list some of them in your handout. Now, a very interesting part of this is that in the work of Richard Hoagland, some of you are familiar with, he runs the Enterprise project where he looks at different things related to the U.S. space exploration program and various esoteric ideas. One of the things that he brought out was this particular NASA photo. And he showed that on this NASA photo, it was looking at the North Pole of Saturn. And on the North Pole of Saturn, what they took a picture of with one of the NASA flybys was that there was a 6-sided hexagonal movement of the clouds on the North Pole of Saturn. And although he doesn't mention it, what you can also see within the form is that there's the form of a 5-pointed star inside the hexagon. And this is actually present energetically in the actual forms photographed on the North Pole of Saturn. And so something is happening energetically to form a pattern, which means that the energetic basis of that location is connected to, once again, our form of the hexagon and the pentagon, or in this case, the pentagram. Now, another thing about this is that this particular form of the 5-pointed star that we see here, which is a bit different than the pure pentagram form, this is the form of the 5-pointed star that one often sees on things like the ceilings of temples and particularly tombs in Egypt. You also find that same pattern on things like the biogeometry cube, which Ibrahim is working with and making available today in his home kit, and which they used in the energy balancing of the city of Hirschberg, Switzerland, when you look at the specific patterns on the cube. So I talked with him about this at one time, and there's a very interesting story related to it, which is that once again, if you take a look, particularly on the ceilings of tombs, and I've seen the same thing also in other locations, like in Rosslyn Chapel, you have all these 5-pointed stars. And for Egyptologists, they primarily just look at it as, well, that represents the stars in the heavens. But speaking to Ibrahim about it, he says it's more involved than that. That essentially, that 5-pointed star form that you see looks just like this in ancient Egypt. They don't use pentagrams as much. It's mostly this type of form. That this particular form is related, number one, to what I described to you before, that the quality of the number 5 expressed through this form is related to protection. And so whereas the stars drawn on the ceilings of the temples are connected to the form of the stars in the heavens, they're also connected to the quality of the number 5. Because you could make a star look with multiple other numbers of arms. It doesn't have to be a 5-pointed star. And the quality of protection, but also with an aspect of geometric resonance. So one thing we found in the biogeometry training, for those of you that did it, and I mentioned it in passing the other day in this course, is that when we changed the form of the pyramid from a pure pyramidal form to making the 1/2 degree indentation down the center of the 4 faces of the pyramid that we described the other day, it changed the energy quality that you can detect coming from the pyramidal form. The reason why there's a line straight down the center of the 4 faces of the 3 major pyramids at Giza Plateau, if you test it, is it changes the energy for the better. Gets rid of a detrimental energy component and brings in much more beneficial energy. So this is connected to something we spoke about on Sunday, so I want to connect a few dots. We talked about the temple science at that time, and we said that there's an aspect of geometric resonance in which things that have a similar energy quality will resonate together and exchange energy and information. And that includes two similar shapes. And we showed you that there's a system in the Egyptian biogeometry whereby certain shapes have an innate resonance with either levels of the human subtle body or with levels of the spiritual planes, or what the Egyptians call the planes of nature. And then the next principle after geometric resonance that we described was the principle of the shape-caused wave. So this is the principle by which you can actually test an energy quality coming from a shape. That's what the shape-caused wave means. The shape emanates an energy quality which is directly detectable. But the idea behind it, once again, which is very important to reinforce for you, is that the reason why changing the shape of the pyramid changed the energy quality that came from it, it was different before than it was after, is because by changing the shape you also changed the geometric resonance. So that rather than the pyramid resonating with the general astral plane, with just a pure form of a pyramid, after making the modification, it now was fine-tuned to resonate with the higher astral. And the reason I'm reinforcing this message is, number one, to make sure that you got it, but number two, because it's connected to the reason why there is a five-pointed star represented multiple times on the ceilings of the tombs of Egypt. And that is that that five-pointed star is meant to create a resonance between the tomb and particular stars in the heavens that the individual at death is supposed to connect to. Just as in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, it says for the person's name to be said and then to be told for them to go to particular locations and not go to other locations at the time of death. So the upshot of it is that that form of the five-pointed star that you see in the Egyptian tombs is meant to be a protective form, but also to connect the person to a higher, more protected area of the higher spiritual worlds that their soul is supposed to go to after death. This is also connected to a deeper esoteric reason why on the form of the cube there is that form of the five-pointed star. This is something that is never harmful, generally beneficial. Having that form of the five-pointed star in the cube, at the very least it will have a protective aspect for the environment it's in. But when they used it in Hirschberg, Switzerland, it had an additional benefit, which is that Hirschberg, Switzerland is at a location that has the highest suicide rate in Switzerland. And it's also a site of historical massacres. A lot of build-up detrimental astral energy in this location. And so part of clearing the energy of that location is also clearing a lot of that built-up very negative astrality and this particular miasm of suicide and death that is at this location. And so using the cubes at this location, the five-pointed star form is then connected to helping the souls of the dead find their way to the correct place in the spiritual worlds, the same as was done in ancient Egypt. So we've talked about the pattern of the tree of life before, and the way that the tree of life is a pattern in the human energy field. That this particular part of the esotericism of the tree of life belongs to the Greek Christian Hermetic school of the man named Stylianos Ateschlis, better known as Daskalos, meaning teacher, from the island of Cyprus. And I have citations of his work in your handouts. Those of you that have actually read your handouts, which I know is rare, actually has information about him and his school. But the thing about this with the Greek Christian Hermetic form of the tree of life is that there are all types of particular patterns in it. So there's a couple of things I want you to make note of right now. You might see the pattern like this in their school and then find out that it operates superimposed on the human energy field like this. And this is something that's actually present within every human energetic field. It's part of the background matrix of energy in the field. Now, what I found interesting about this is that this is so central for the Western system. So in this Greek school they use it, in the Jewish Kabbalah they use it, and then it got handed down through the whole Western system with Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But I didn't see it so much looking at things in Asia. And I thought, I'll bet there's something in Asia that has this pattern. And so finally I found a pattern from a internal energy development system in China that was connected to the White Cloud Monastery. And information about the White Cloud Monastery has only become public in the very recent past. And to make a long story short, there's a particular pattern that they use there that has to do with these three axes in the body, the central axis and the two sides, that's very similar to the three pillars in the tree of life in which they connect to solar and lunar forces. And they have specific forms of Qigong development. That's a solar form and a lunar form that connects to these three pillars in the human energy field, just like the three pillars of the Kabbalistic tree of life. Because again, if it's a universal pattern, people in different traditions are going to pick it up at some point. So we have these different positions of the tree of life that actually exist in energetic space around us. Any person can get to the point that they can begin to perceive the presence of this energy pattern within their field. And within particular schools, you would train with this in great depth. You would use practices similar to what we call zero-point centering to move your energy and attention directly into the centers in your field connected to the tree of life, and to work with them in particular ways. So for instance, in this Greek Christian Hermetic school, they would work in creating particular triangles in the field. So as you see here, from the point above the head, and we talked about this point or platform above the head, which in the tree of life would be the first Sephira or Keter, they have a form of a triangle connecting that to the second and third platform, which actually exists as spheres of light directly above the shoulders. And that this becomes a very powerful energy form around the human head, and is connected to some of the highest of their initiation work. And that then breaks up into four triangles, which we've looked at before as the form of the tetrahedral net. Because if you were to fold it up, it would make the form of a tetrahedron, same as you saw in the Vesica Pisces. You know, one of the challenges of teaching something like sacred geometry is that everything connects to everything else. So until we get certain pieces of information or certain patterns down, I can't make particular connections. But now we know the Vesica Pisces and know the tetrahedron pattern and can recognize it here. So they talk about the energetic of the entire triangle, and they have particular terms in Greek that they use for it, which in English would translate to something like absolute infinite beingness, and then it would then break up to the form of the Trinity. And so, for instance, over the human left shoulder, the triangle toward the left shoulder is the triangle connected to the Holy Spirit in their system, and over the right shoulder is the triangle that would be connected with the Logos, with the Christos. And so again, this is a Greek Christian Hermetic form of training. So in the creation of this triangle around the head, it creates a very powerful energy form. And they use other types of secondary triangles, like they will make a triangle of energy from the points above the shoulders to the point of the thymus. And they will fill that triangle with light to cleanse and activate the thymus. Or they might make a triangle from the points above the shoulders to the place at the solar plexus. And again, fill that with particular types of light to cleanse and activate those centers. But I want to come now back to our point on the 5 and 6 pointed stars and show you that at these particular locations, they have in their initiation documents representations of particular geometries, and in some cases Egyptian symbols connected to the different locations, which has to do with the function of the locations. So what you see here is the form of a 6-pointed star with a cross in it. Here, at this particular center, connected to the 5-pointed star. This center is also connected to reproductive function, and the 5-pointed star as the etheric life energy is then connected to the reproductive organs, because the reproductive organs of the body are the etheric organs, physical organs of the human being. It's the pure expression of life energy through human sexual organs that creates new life in the world, and which then gets circulated in particular geometric patterns in internal alchemy. So the thing about seeing these patterns is that in these initiation schools, and particularly in this particular Greek Christian Hermetic school, there are patterns of this type at different layers of the human energy field, because this tree of life pattern has different layers to it. There's one layer that's connected to the human etheric life body. There's one layer that's connected to the human astral body of consciousness. And there's a layer that's connected directly to the spirit. So that if you go more deeply into their school, and they've only made a certain small amount of their information public, they will give you information on particular layers according to the geometry shown at that layer as its function at that part of the center. Now, one of the very important things about their work with the 5 and 6 pointed stars is that in this particular Greek school, and again I want to emphasize that this is a very important and powerful school, and Stylianos of Teslos was a very advanced adept who was teaching this material. Again, this was the fellow who could write ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic text having never studied ancient Egyptian. He could speak Sanskrit having never studied Sanskrit. etc., etc. Also a very powerful energy healer, and he was also known for his capacity to do fully conscious forms of out-of-body travel, and through a process they taught in their school, he could materialize his physical hand, or an etheric hand, back into space to take action in physical space, although his body was elsewhere. And this is related to the work they did with the Tree of Life, understanding the Tree of Life as a glyph of manifestation. So again, this is a person who was hidden to the public until he was revealed by this work that I tell you all about in the handouts, by this person from the University of Maine, who wrote several texts about him. And in their work, the 5 and 6-pointed stars are central. They're very, very important. So they see the 5-pointed star as symbolizing the personality of the human being, what they call the present personality. So at the level of the 5-pointed star, that in many traditions would then be called the etheric body, they would connect to our function of our present personality. Now what they meant by that is that the 5-pointed star is then connected to how you conceive yourself in your present incarnation. So I think of myself as Robert Gilbert. I come from Scottish ancestry. I live in Asheville, North Carolina. I like this, I don't like that. I'm tall and skinny, I wear glasses, blah, blah, blah. It's my identification right here and now. But of course, that's not necessarily me across time. If you look at oneself as a multifaceted being that has multiple incarnations at multiple time periods and is part of a larger entity, then that part of ourselves is represented by the 6-pointed star. That's what they would call the permanent personality, or who we are at our spiritual core across multiple incarnations. And so in the deeper esoteric work of their order, again, this is a very important aspect. The 5-pointed star connected to the present personality, 6-pointed star to the permanent personality. And they particularly teach you how to use these stars in very direct ways for, to begin with, energetic protection. So one of the first things they would teach you is to create a 5-pointed star in your energy field to protect it. And part of this is because there is a particular form used in black magic in the Mediterranean, which is used to harm a person or potentially even to kill a person, that harms the energy field in a very direct way, that in a sense the upright 5-pointed star in the field is the antidote to it. It literally breaks apart the geometry of this particular form used in black magic in the Mediterranean. So one of the first things they train you to do is to create in light or fire energetically this 5-pointed star protecting the field. And they'll trace it according to using one hand or the other hand or both hands with particular directions, and also using particular types of colored light or flame to resonate that 5-pointed star with specific archangelic beings. Again, this is a very deep esoteric school coming from the Greek tradition. After you've gotten to the point where you've stabilized the 5-pointed star in the field and you've become accustomed to that, then at a later time they'll have you build the 6-pointed star surrounding the 5-pointed star. And that further reinforces the field and adds in extra energetic functions. There's other things they do as well, but at this point we're going to stick with the 5- and 6-pointed star to give you a sense of how this stuff is actually applied in active esoteric lodges that know what they're doing. So this particular form here is the form connected to the spiritual layer of the part of the Tree of Life that I showed you that connects to the human heart, center number 6 on the Greek Christian Hermetic Tree of Life. And at this deeper layer of the Tree of Life, at the heart center, it has a pattern with a 6-pointed star containing a 5-pointed star and containing the hieroglyphs from ancient Egypt for 3 particular forms. The first one is the one you see here. It's the form for Mer, meaning love. We talked about this in passing the other day when we talked about Merkaba, that Mer is a prefix in ancient Egyptian meaning love. Again, people in the Jewish Kabbalah do not accept that there's anything Egyptian about Merkaba. They use a different derivation. But as far as the pure sound, there seems to be a connection. Then this pattern here of the Ankh we're all familiar with, and it connects to the function of life. And this one here, which is the feather of Ma'at, it's an ostrich feather, is connected to truth. So from one perspective, it's connected to love, life, and truth at this place in the heart, and also to the functions of the 5- and 6-pointed star. It's also connected to a particular mantric phrase that they use using the sounds of power from ancient Egypt, which is connected to this ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic text, which translated into English says, "Homage to you, dweller in peace, Lord of joy of heart." Now there's one other aspect of this that I want to bring out to you, which is I said before that in this connection to the concept of Merkabah, this chariot of movement through higher heavens, that in the Jewish tradition they use the root rachev, which means to leave one's normal place and travel, as the root of the term Merkabah, the chariot of movement in higher worlds. But the actual syllables of Merkabah in ancient Egyptian would connect to the mer, meaning love. And let me just say something about this hieroglyph. For a long time I looked at this hieroglyph and said, how does this shape have anything to do with love? But it actually is connected to a function. And that is that in ancient Egypt, an ancient Egyptian would know this, but I don't know it until I finally figured it out by looking at old Egyptian works, is that this particular pattern is actually the form of a hoe that you would draw through the ground to make a furrow in the ground. And it's a handheld hoe that you would pull as a plow along the earth. And what it does is it opens up the earth to receive the seed. And it was connected in the functional consciousness of the Egyptians, that they understood that the opening of the earth to receive the seed had to do with this concept of becoming a doctor to the earth, a healer of the earth, a co-creator with the earth, and putting life into the earth to continue to grow. So it's connected to the function of love. So this mer is the first part. Then we have the ka and the ba. Well, the ka is connected to the Egyptian name for the etheric life body. And if you look at this next pattern of the ok, it's connected to life. And the ba is connected to the human astral body. One of the core aspects of the astrality of a person that affects their resonance capacity is whether or not they are living in truth. And so this form that is shown next, that of the feather of Ma'at, is connected to truth. So from one perspective, I see this as also connected to the concept of Merkabah, because it has to do with the force of love and life and truth. And from my perspective also, to creating that transformation of the human subtle bodies to where they can resonate with higher worlds and be a vehicle for our spiritual awareness to move through higher worlds in an alchemical process, which is why you see them at the heart center in the Tree of Life in this Greek school. So what I'm trying to do here is trying to take off a few veils of the deeper waters of some of these schools with the Egyptian and the Greek, and the way that these 5- and 6-pointed star geometries are part of a larger matrix. And now I want to say a little bit about another form that is very commonly encountered, and that is the form of an octagon, which is an 8-sided enclosure, or an octagram, which is an 8-pointed star, because you see that in many occasions. Now the octagon is the form that one often sees in sacred architecture, and in fact if you look at the original notebooks of Leonardo da Vinci, he has a drawing in his notebooks of the perfect temple, and the form of that temple in his notebooks is an octagon. And we find it in many other types of sacred structures as well. I mentioned to you before that the Knights Templar constructed their temples either as a perfect circle or as an octagon. And one of the classic forms of the octagon is the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. This is the mosque that is currently at the site of the old Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. And so it's a highly contested site, and it's one of the most holy locations in the world, particularly for the 3 monotheistic traditions. So this whole building is constructed as the form of an octagon. And you find this type of form throughout, particularly Islamic architecture, but really for multiple traditions. And there's a particular aspect with this 8-sided geometry. One thing that we've mentioned before in this class and explored in detail in the biogeometry class is that the form of a square rotated on a square, which we actually saw before with our square root of 2 geometries, with the 3 sacred roots, creates something that in biogeometry is referred to as virtual rotation. In other words, an 8-pointed star form gives you the energy that acts as if it's rotating, even though it's actually a static form. And whenever you rotate something, it creates a center of the rotation, and that creates BG3. So to make a long story short, an 8-sided enclosure creates a BG3 effect. Also, to connect a dot for those of you that have done the biogeometry course or who have read my book on the Egyptian European energy work, there's another form that we use called a 45-degree emitter, which is 45-degree angles coming off a baseline. That creates a BG3 effect with the 45-degree angles. And so let me connect a dot here to the form of the octagon, where you have these 45-degree angles coming off each of the sides. So the whole thing is based on this 45-degree rotation. And in deeper layers of biogeometry, we get into some of the aspects of how the different spiritual planes correspond to certain angles. And one of the higher spiritual planes is connected to at that 45-degree angle. This is the inside of a mosque, and it's got this beautiful form where it's got the form of the rotated square at the very ceiling. And again, it's creating an 8-pointed star form. But it can also be seen as a square rotated on a square, which again brings us back to our square root of 2 geometries from the 3 sacred roots, and to our virtual rotation concept. And this form is also used in sacred art, as you see here in the Adoration of the Magi. Now this is another aspect of the 8-pointed star form, and that is that the 8-pointed star form is often connected to the divine feminine. It's actually an aspect of the divine Sophia. So that in this case, they use the form of the 8-pointed star form as a matrix to create the Adoration of the Magi painting. Because the Adoration of the Magi is a connection to the divine feminine. It's when the 3 Magi come to see the Christ child that is being held by Mary and the birth of the child. And there are multiple manifestations of the 8-pointed star geometry in the tradition of the divine feminine. Before we go there, let me make just a quick side comment, which is that with the basic aspect of the cross and the rotated cross on it, which could be a rotated square, which gives you the 8 directions of space, and also gives you the basis of an octagon or an 8-pointed star form, if you look at certain Masonic texts, they will talk about the origin for the shapes of the letters in the English alphabet or for the Arabic numerals, being that they all fit on this template of a square with a cross in the center and a rotated cross in it to divide it into 8 pieces. So that all these different forms for the letters of the alphabet and the numbers would fit on that matrix. We're going to get into a little bit more on higher dimensions in the next couple of days, and hopefully have you build a 3-dimensional form with the Zoom tools of a 4th-dimensional cube, so you begin to get a sense of dimensional projections into forms, some of the slightly deeper waters in sacred geometry. But at this point, I'll just say that this is basically a cube, and here's another cube, and they're connected up with other cubes making the form of a hypercube. Again, we'll explain that in more detail coming up in the next day or two. But the point I want to make right here, the connection to make to what we're looking at right now, is that if you were to see this hypercube, which is 4th dimensional, projected not just into 3 dimensions, but into 2 dimensions, and seen from this perspective, then you get the form of the 8-pointed star inside of the form. And we mentioned this at the beginning of the class, that these higher dimensional forms projected into lower dimensional space can sometimes create shapes that we can identify according to other context. This is the Great Empowerment Charm Wheel from the Tibetan tradition, and you see it within this 8-sided enclosure. And this 8-sided enclosure is found also in many types of Hindu yantras. It's a really archetypal form that is used for an enclosure for the things inside the charm or the yantra or whatever the ritual work that is being done. So it's really a universal mystery using the power of the 8-sided star form. So here's an image of the Black Madonna from the south of France. And in the background of it, you see this kind of dark blue or purple sort of color. And on it, you then have these golden stars. And if you look closely at the golden stars, they are all 8-pointed. So why is there all of these 8-pointed stars in the background of the Black Madonna? Again, the 8-pointed star is connected to the energetic of the divine feminine. You getting the beach ball of death again? Okay. So this particular form is that of what's known as a Kaduru stone from Mesopotamia. You see a lot of them from ancient Babylon, places like that. And these stones commemorate certain things. They have particular teachings on them. There's a lot of embedded information on these stones. I'm always interested in things like the portals within portals that are represented on the stones. But for today, our story has to do with the patterns at the top. And the patterns here, this is a pattern for the sun, this is a pattern for the moon, and this is a pattern for Venus. And notice that their pattern for Venus is connected to the form of an 8-pointed star. And here, in the Catholic tradition, we also see the form of the 8-pointed star behind the Madonna. So again, a clear connection here between the 8-pointed star geometry and the Divine Feminine. I had a friend who led a group once to particular Divine Feminine sites in Britain, and one of the men on the trip had this kind of spontaneous vision at one of the places where he saw an 8-pointed star. And he didn't know anything about the relationship between the 8-pointed star and the Divine Feminine. He'd never seen a representation of it. And even the person leading the group wasn't aware of that connection. So when they came back and told me about it, I said that's a very good sign for this individual, that he received the spontaneous download, that perception of the packed thought form to perceive the 8-pointed star at this particular location of the Divine Feminine mysteries. And again, one of my interpretations about this form would be that with this idea of the square being the form for manifestation, being the form for a matrix of creation, as we've seen all over the place with the squared circle and the form of the cube, etc., that this particular form for manifestation with the square and the cube, when you then take the second square or cube and rotate it on it, then you get that energetic that we described with the BG3 coming from it. And so this has an aspect connected to the Divine Feminine. And in fact, our term matrix is of course connected to the term mater, or mother. The matrix is the mother. This energetic matrix that makes up the world is, in a sense, the Divine Feminine. It is connected to the Sophia. It is the matrix in which spirits are allowed to be born into this world through the creation of form, just as we take on our form within the matrix of the energetic of the mother's womb. I'm going to cover just a couple more things, and then we'll take our last break of the day. This particular slide starts our discussion of a topic that has to do with the representation of the elements according to particular shapes. So the elements earth, air, fire, water, ether are connected to these representations of particular shapes. This is from a particular body of work in the Ayurvedic tradition in India. And in the Ayurvedic tradition, they talk about the different qualities of earth, air, fire, and water, and the ether, and have shapes associated with them that are shown here. Because this particular text talks about the secrets of the pulse, and how to take the energetic pulses of a human being, and how it's connected to these 5 energies. This shows a breakdown of locations actually within the nose. And so this is the front of the nose, and this is the separator, the septum of the nose right here, and this is the left nostril, and here's the right nostril. What it shows is, for this particular system that they're using, earth is connected to a square. Pretty much find that everywhere. Water connected to the form of the crescent moon. That's also fairly universal. Fire connected to the form of the triangle. In this particular system, they're using the form of the hexagon to connect to air, and the circle for space or for ether, although that's not universal, and we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. But it's showing you that here we have the triangle of fire toward the front of the nose, and there's actually a fire element aspect toward the front of the nose. Then moving back toward the air and the ether toward the center, and then toward the outside back, the water, and toward the back inside to the earth, so that in different locations the different elements of energy have their function. And by the same token, in taking the pulses, one can detect different qualities related to these 5 energies. Now these 5 energies are referred to in the Indian system as the tattvas, meaning the elements. And the base system is based on 5 tattvas, earth, air, fire, water, and ether. But there's actually within other systems in India a system of 25 tattvas, and for the Kashmiri Shaivites In other words, Shaivism that is practiced in the Kashmir region, that is between India and Pakistan, they have a system of 36 tattvas. However, only the base 5 tattvas in any system are related directly to these 5 elements. The other ones are more advanced spiritual functions of a human being within these more complex systems. So the use of these types of shapes to relate to elements which hold particular archetypal energy qualities, is used in systems such as this, in which these are tattva cards, originally based on ideas coming from the Yantra systems of India, and then adapted, particularly into Western magical lodges, such as the Golden Dawn that I referred to before, where these particular combinations of shapes are used as a type of astral portal or gateway to meditate upon to connect to different planetary forces. For instance, this is a set of particular shapes related to the tattvas that, for this case, connects you to the sun. So it's the set of the shapes in particular configurations with particular colors to different shapes that then work to create an energetic matrix that resonates with the power of the sun or the other planets, or over here with the power of Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces, etc. So using these 5 shapes and forms for their primal elemental power in particular sets of colors and juxtapositions to then be a particular set of energetics to create the blueprint for any of these different energy patterns. So you have to understand where the patterns come from to understand what this type of way of working is. And then we showed you on the opening weekend with the idea of the sacred design and sacred architecture that in feng shui and similar systems like Vastu Vidya, they talk about the way that certain shapes connect to the elemental forces. And this then comes into the shapes that are used for different buildings, for the different energetics of them. So as we mentioned at that time, the form of the triangle is connected archetypally to the color red. And it is used primarily in the East for sacred buildings and temples. As I mentioned, there are places in the East where they say don't build your home next to a temple because it could burn down. There's too much fire energy there. Not recommended for places where a human being is going to live, but rather for a place of worship. And then rectangular shapes connected to the element of wood, and curving or horizontal shapes connected to the power of water, round shapes like geodesics connected to the quality of metal, and then square shapes, of course, connected to the power of earth. So we're looking at a particular system in which the shapes then correspond to particular energy qualities. And those of you that have a background in things like Chinese medicine know just how involved these particular energy relationships are. When you study a person's energetic matrix, you find that they might have a dominance of a particular element or another in their energy body, which will need to be balanced by another element. This can also be true within the organs of the body, and that will then lead to what herbs they are prescribed, or what acupuncture point needs to be worked with, things of that kind. Well, let's go ahead and take our last break of the day, and we'll come back in 10 minutes